Chapter 6. How Mr. McCunn departed with relief and returned with resolution. At 7 o'clock on the following morning the post-cart, summoned by an early message from Mrs. Moran, appeared outside the cottage. In it sat the ancient postman, whose real home was Auchenlaken, but who slept alternate nights in Dalcarter, and beside him Dobson the innkeeper. Dickson and his hostess stood at the garden gate, the former with his pack on his back and at his feet a small stout wooden box, of the kind in which cheeses are transported, garnished with an immense padlock. Heritage for obvious reasons did not appear. At the moment he was crouched on the floor of the loft watching the departure through a gap in the dimity curtains. The traveller, after making sure that Dobson was looking, furtively slipped the key of the trunk into his knapsack. "Well, good-bye, Auntie Femi," he said. "I'm sure you've been awful kind to me, and I don't know how to thank you for all you're sending." "Tuts, Dickson, my man, they're hungry folk about Gleska that'll be glad o' my scones and geely. Tell Mirren I'm ral please wi her man and haste ye back soon." The trunk was deposited on the floor of the cart and Dickson clambered into the back seat. He was thankful that he had not to sit next to Dobson, for he had tell-tale stuff on his person. The morning was wet, so he wore his waterproof, which concealed his odd tendency to stoutness about the middle. Mrs. Moran played her part well, with all the becoming gravity of an affectionate aunt, but so soon as the post-cart turned the bend of the road her demeanor changed. She was torn with convulsions of silent laughter. She retreated to the kitchen, sunk into a chair, wrapped her face in her apron and rocked. Heritage, descending, found her struggling to regain composure. "D'ye ken his wife's name?" she gasped. "I see ed her Mirren. And maybe the body's no married. Hexers. Hexers." Meantime Dickson was bumping along the moor road on the back of the post-cart. He had worked out a plan, just as he had been used aforetime to devise a deal in foodstuffs. He had expected one of the watchers to turn up, and was rather relieved that it should be Dobson, whom he regarded as the most natural beast of the three. Somehow he did not think that he would be molested before he reached the station, since his enemies would still be undecided in their minds. Probably they only wanted to make sure that he had really departed to forget all about him. But if not, he had his plan ready. "Are you travelling today?" he asked the innkeeper. "Just as far as the station to see about some oil cake I'm expectin'. What's in your wee kist? Ye came here wi nothing but the bag on your back." The kist is no mine. It's my auntie's. She's a kind body, and nothing would serve but she must pack a box for me to take back. Let me see. There's a baking of scones, 3 pots of honey and 1 of rhubarb jam. She was famous for her rhubarb jam, a mutton ham, which you can't get for love or money in Glasgow, some home-made black puddings and a wee skim milk cheese. I doubt I'll have to take a cab from the station." Dobson appeared satisfied, lit a short pipe and relapsed into meditation. The long uphill road, ever climbing to where far off showed the tiny whitewashed buildings which were the railway station, seemed interminable this morning. The aged postman addressed strange objurgations to his aged horse and muttered reflections to himself, the innkeeper smoked, and Dickson stared back into the misty hollow where lay Dalcarter. The south-west wind had brought up a screen of rain clouds and washed all the countryside in a soft wet grey. But the eye could still travel a fair distance, and Dickson thought he had a glimpse of a figure on a bicycle leaving the village 2 miles back. He wondered who it could be. Not Heritage, who had no bicycle. Perhaps some woman who was conspicuously late for the train. Women were the chief cyclists nowadays in country places. Then he forgot about the bicycle and twisted his neck to watch the station. It was less than a mile off now, and they had no time to spare, for away to the south among the hummocks of the bog he saw the smoke of the train coming from Auchenlaken. The postman also saw it and whipped up his beast into a clumsy canter. Dickson, always nervous about being late for trains, forced his eyes away and regarded again the road behind them. Suddenly the cyclist had become quite plain, a little more than a mile behind a man, and pedalling furiously in spite of the stiff ascent. It could only be one person, Leon. He must have discovered their visit to the house yesterday and be on the way to warn Dobson. If he reached the station before the train, there would be no journey to Glasgow that day for one respectable citizen. Dickson was in a fever of impatience and fright. He dared not abjure the postman to hurry, lest Dobson should turn his head and descry his colleague. But that ancient man had begun to realize the shortness of time and was urging the cart along at a fair pace, since they were now on the flatter shelf of land which carried the railway. Dickson kept his eyes fixed on the bicycle and his teeth shut tight on his lower lip. Now it was hidden by the last dip of hill, now it emerged into view not a quarter of a mile behind, and its rider gave vent to a shrill call. Luckily the innkeeper did not hear, for at that moment with a jolt the cart pulled up at the station door, accompanied by the roar of the incoming train. Dickson whipped down from the back seat and seized the solitary porter. "Label the box for Glasgow and into the van with it. Quick, man, and there'll be a shilling for you." He had been doing some rapid thinking these last minutes and had made up his mind. If Dobson and he were alone in a carriage he could not have the box there, that must be elsewhere, so that Dobson could not examine it if he were set on violence, somewhere in which it could still be a focus of suspicion and attract attention from his person. He took his ticket, and rushed onto the platform, to find the porter and the box at the door of the guard's van. Dobson was not there. With the vigor of a fussy traveller he shouted directions to the guard to take good care of his luggage, hurled a shilling at the porter and ran for a carriage. At that moment he became aware of Dobson hurrying through the entrance. He must have met Leon and heard news from him, for his face was red and his ugly brows darkening. The train was in motion. "Here, you!" Dobson's voice shouted. "Stop! I want a word with." Dickson plunged at a third-class carriage, for he saw faces behind the misty panes, and above all things then he feared an empty compartment. He clambered onto the step, but the handle would not turn, and with a sharp pang of fear he felt the innkeeper's grip on his arm. Then some Samaritan from within let down the window, opened the door and pulled him up. He fell on a seat and a second later Dobson staggered in beside him. Thank heaven, the dirty little carriage was nearly full. There were two herds, each with a dog and a long hazel crook, and an elderly woman who looked like a ploughman's wife out for a day's marketing. And there was one other whom Dickson recognized with a peculiar joy, the bagman in the provision line of business whom he had met 3 days before at Kilchrist. The recognition was mutual. "Mr. McCunn," the bagman exclaimed. "My, but that was running it fine. I hope you've had a pleasant holiday, sir?" "Very pleasant. I've been spending 2 nights with friends down here a ways. I've been very fortunate in the weather, for it has broke just when I'm leaving." Dickson sank back on the hard cushions. It had been a near thing, but so far he had won. He wished his heart did not beat so fast, and he hoped he did not betray his disorder in his face. Very deliberately he hunted for his pipe and filled it slowly. Then he turned to Dobson. "I didn't know you were traveling the day. What about your oiled cake?" "I've changed my mind," was the gruff answer. "Was that you I heard crying on me, when we were running for the train?" "Eh? I thought ye had forgot about your kist." "No fear," said Dickson. "I'm no likely to forget my auntie's scones." He laughed pleasantly and then turned to the bagman. Thereafter the compartment hummed with the technicalities of the grocery trade. He exerted himself to draw out his companion, to have him refer to the great firm of D. McCunn, so that the innkeeper might be ashamed of his suspicions. What nonsense to imagine that a noted and wealthy Glasgow merchant, the bagman's tone was almost reverential, would concern himself with the affairs of a forgotten village and a tumble-down house. Presently the train drew up at Kirkmichael station. The woman descended, and Dobson, after making sure that no one else meant to follow her example, also left the carriage. A porter was shouting, Fast train to Glasgow, Glasgow next stop. Dickson watched the innkeeper shoulder his way through the crowd in the direction of the booking office. He's off to send a telegram, he decided. There'll be trouble waiting for me at the other end. When the train moved on, he found himself disinclined for further talk. He had suddenly become meditative, and curled up in a corner with his head hard against the window pane, watching the wet fields and glistening roads as they slipped past. He had his plans made for his conduct at Glasgow, but Lord! How he loathed the whole business. Last night he had had a kind of gusto in his desire to circumvent villainy. At Doukharter station he had enjoyed a momentary sense of triumph. Now he felt very small, lonely and forlorn. Only one thought far at the back of his mind cropped up now and then to give him comfort. He was entering on the last lap. Once get this detestable errand done and he would be a free man, free to go back to the kindly humdrum life from which he should never have strayed. Never again, he vowed, never again. Rather would he spend the rest of his days in hydropathics than come within the pale of such horrible adventures. Romance, forsooth. This was not the mild goddess he had sought, but an awful harpy who battened on the souls of men. He had some bad minutes as the train passed through the suburbs, and along the grimy embankment by which the southern lines enter the city. But as it rumbled over the river bridge and slowed down before the terminus, his vitality suddenly revived. He was a businessman, and there was now something for him to do. After a rapid farewell to the bagman, he found a porter and hustled his box out of the van in the direction of the left luggage office. Spies, summoned by Dobson's telegram, were, he was convinced, watching his every movement, and he meant to see that they missed nothing. He received his ticket for the box, and slowly and ostentatiously stowed it away in his pack. Swinging the said pack on his arm, he sauntered through the entrance hall to the row of waiting taxi-cabs, and selected that one which seemed to him to have the oldest and most doddering driver. He deposited the pack inside on the seat, and then stood still as if struck with a sudden thought. I breakfasted terrible early, he told the driver. I think I'll have a bite to eat. Will you wait? Said the man, who was reading a grubby sheet of newspaper. I'll wait as long as you like, for it's you that pays. Dickson left his pack in the cab and, oddly enough for a careful man, he did not shut the door. He re-entered the station, strolled to the bookstall and bought a Glasgow Herald. His steps then tended to the refreshment room, where he ordered a cup of coffee and 2 bath buns, and seated himself at a small table. There he was soon immersed in the financial news, and though he sipped his coffee he left the buns untasted. He took out a penknife and cut various extracts from the Herald, bestowing them carefully in his pocket. An observer would have seen an elderly gentleman absorbed in market quotations. After a quarter of an hour had been spent in this performance, he happened to glance at the clock and rose with an exclamation. He bustled out to his taxi and found the driver still intent upon his reading. Here I am at last, he said cheerily, and had a foot on the step, when he stopped suddenly with a cry. It was a cry of alarm, but also of satisfaction. What's become of my pack? I left it on the seat, and now it's gone. There's been a thief here. The driver, roused from his lethargy, protested in the name of his gods that no one had been near it. You took it into the station WIE, he urged. I did nothing of the kind. Just you wait here till I see the inspector. A bonny watch you keep on a gentleman's things. But Dickson did not interview the railway authorities. Instead he hurried to the left luggage office. I deposited a small box here a short time ago. I mind the number. Is it there still? The attendant glanced at a shelf. A wee deal box with iron bands. It was took out 10 minutes sign. A man bought the ticket and took it away on his shoulder. Thank you. There's been a mistake, but the blame's mine. My man mistook my orders. Then he returned to the now nervous taxi driver. I've taken it up with the station master and he's putting the police on. You'll likely be wanted, so I gave him your number. It's a fair disgrace that there should be so many thieves about this station. It's not the first time I've lost things. Drive me to West George Street and look sharp." And he slammed the door with the violence of an angry man. But his reflections were not violent, for he smiled to himself. That was pretty neat. They'll take some time to get the kist open, for I dropped the key out of the train after we left Kirkmichael. That gives me a fair start. If I hadn't thought of that, they'd have found some way to grip me and ripe me long before I got to the bank. He shuddered as he thought of the dangers he had escaped. As it is, they're off the track for half an hour at least, while they're rummaging among Auntie Femi's scones. At the thought he laughed heartily, and when he brought the taxi cab to a standstill by rapping on the front window, he left it with a temper apparently restored. Obviously he had no grudge against the driver, who to his immense surprise was rewarded with 10 shillings. 3 minutes later Mr. McCunn might have been seen entering the head office of the Strathclyde Bank, and inquiring for the manager. There was no hesitation about him now, for his foot was on his native heath. The chief cashier received him with deference, in spite of his unorthodox garb, for he was not the least honoured of the bank's customers. As it chanced he had been talking about him that very morning to a gentleman from London. "The strength of this city," he had said, tapping his eyeglasses on his knuckles, "does not lie in its dozen very rich men, but in the 100 or 2 homely folk who make no parade of wealth. Men like Dickson McCunn, for example, who live all their life in a semi-detached villa and die worth $500,000. And the Londoner had cordially assented. So Dickson was ushered promptly into an inner room, and was warmly greeted by Mr. Mackintosh, the patron of the Gorbals Die-Hards. "I must thank you for your generous donation, McCunn. Those boys will get a little fresh air and quiet after the smoke and din of Glasgow. A little country peace to smooth out the creases in their poor little souls." "Maybe," said Dickson, with a vivid recollection of Dougal as he had last seen him. Somehow he did not think that peace was likely to be the portion of that devoted band. "But I've not come here to speak about that." He took off his waterproof, then his coat and waistcoat, and showed himself a strange figure with sundry bulges about the middle. The manager's eyes grew very round. Presently these excrescences were revealed as linen bags sewn onto his shirt, and fitting into the hollow between ribs and hip. With some difficulty he slit the bags and extracted 3 hide-bound packages. "See here, Mackintosh," he said solemnly. "I hand you over these parcels, and you're to put them in the innermost corner of your strong room. You needn't open them. Just put them away as they are, and write me a receipt for them. Write it now." Mr. Mackintosh obediently took pen in hand. "What'll I call them?" he asked. "Just the 3 leather parcels handed to you by Dickson McCunn, Esquire," naming the date. Mr. Mackintosh wrote. He signed his name with his usual flourish and handed the slip to his client. "Now," said Dickson, "you'll put that receipt in the strong box where you keep my securities, and you'll give it up to nobody but me in person, and you'll surrender the parcels only on presentation of the receipt. Do you understand?" "Perfectly. May I ask any questions?" "You'd better not if you don't want to hear Lee's." "What's in the packages?" Mr. Mackintosh weighed them in his hand. "That's asking," said Dickson. "But I'll tell ye this much. It's jewels." "Your own?" "No, but I'm their trustee." "Valuable?" "I was hearing they were worth more than £1 million. "God bless my soul," said the startled manager. "I don't like this kind of business, McCunn." "No more do I. But you'll do it to oblige an old friend and a good customer. If you don't know much about the packages you know all about me. Now, mind, I trust you." Mr. Mackintosh forced himself to a joke. "Did you maybe steal them?" Dickson grinned. "Just what I did. And that being so, I want you to let me out by the back door. When he found himself in the street, he felt the huge relief of a boy who had emerged with credit from the dentist's chair. Remembering that there would be no midday dinner for him at home, his first step was to feed heavily at a restaurant. He had, so far as he could see, surmounted all his troubles, his one regret being that he had lost his pack, which contained among other things his Isaac Walton and his safety razor. He bought another razor and a new Walton, and mounted an electric tram car en route for home. Very contented with himself he felt as the car swung across the Clyde Bridge. He had done well, but of that he did not want to think, for the whole beastly thing was over. He was going to bury that memory, to be resurrected perhaps on a later day when the unpleasantness had been forgotten. Heritage had his address, and knew where to come when it was time to claim the jewels. As for the watchers, they must have ceased to suspect him, when they discovered the innocent contents of his knapsack and Mrs. Moran's box. Home for him, and a luxurious tea by his own fireside, and then an evening with his books, for Heritage's nonsense had stimulated his literary fervor. He would dip into his old favorites again to confirm his faith. Tomorrow he would go for a jaunt somewhere, perhaps down the Clyde, or to the south of England, which he had heard was a pleasant, thickly peopled country. No more lonely inns and deserted villages for him, henceforth he would make certain of comfort and peace. The rain had stopped, and, as the car moved down the dreary vista of Eglinton Street, the sky opened into fields of blue and the April sun silvered the puddles. It was in such place and under such weather that Dickson suffered an overwhelming experience. It is beyond my skill, being all unlearned in the game of psycho-analysis, to explain how this thing happened. I concern myself only with facts. Suddenly the pretty veil of self-satisfaction was rent from top to bottom, and Dickson saw a figure of himself within, a smug leaden little figure which simpered and preened itself and was hollow as a rotten nut. And he hated it. The horrid truth burst on him that Heritage had been right. He only played with life. That imbecile image was a mere spectator, content to applaud, but shrinking from the contact of reality. It had been all right as a provision merchant, but when it fancied itself capable of higher things it had deceived itself. Foolish little image with its brave dreams and its swelling words from Browning. All make-believe of the feeblest. He was a coward, running away at the first threat of danger. It was as if he were watching a tall stranger with a wand pointing to the embarrassed phantom that was himself, and ruthlessly exposing its frailties. And yet the pitiless showman was himself too, himself as he wanted to be, cheerful, brave, resourceful, indomitable. Dickson suffered a spasm of mortal agony. "Oh, I'm surely not so bad as all that," he groaned. But the hurt was not only in his pride. He saw himself being forced to new decisions, and each alternative was of the blackest. He fairly shivered with the horror of it. The car slipped past a suburban station from which passengers were emerging, comfortable black-coated men such as he had once been. He was bitterly angry with Providence for picking him out of the great crowd of sedentary folk for this sore ordeal. "Why was I tethered to such a conscience?" was his moan. But there was that stern inquisitor with his pointer exploring his soul. "You flatter yourself you have done your share," he was saying. "You will make pretty stories about it to yourself, and someday you may tell your friends, modestly disclaiming any special credit. But you will be a liar, for you know you are afraid. You are running away when the work is scarcely begun, and leaving it to a few boys and a poet whom you had the impudence the other day to despise. I think you are worse than a coward. I think you are a cad." His fellow passengers on the top of the car saw an absorbed middle-aged gentleman who seemed to have something the matter with his bronchial tubes. They could not guess at the tortured soul. The decision was coming nearer, the alternatives loomed up dark and inevitable. On one side was submission to ignominy, on the other a return to that place, which he detested, and yet loathed himself for detesting. "It seems I'm not likely to have much peace either way," he reflected dismally. How the conflict would have ended had it continued on these lines I cannot say. The soul of Mr. McCunn was being assailed by moral and metaphysical adversaries with which he had not been trained to deal. But suddenly it leapt from negatives to positives. He saw the face of the girl in the shuttered house, so fair and young and yet so haggard. It seemed to be appealing to him to rescue it from a great loneliness and fear. Yes, he had been right, it had a strange look of his Janet, the wide, open eyes, the solemn mouth. What was to become of that child if he failed her in her great need? Now Dickson was a practical man, and this view of the case brought him into a world which he understood. It's fair ridiculous, he reflected. Nobody there to take a grip of things. Just a wing Gorbals Keeleys and the lad Heritage. Not a businessman among the lot. The alternatives, which hove before him like two great banks of cloud, were altering their appearance. One was becoming faint and tenuous, the other, solid as ever, was just a shade less black. He lifted his eyes and saw in the near distance the corner of the road which led to his home. I must decide before I reach that corner, he told himself. Then his mind became apathetic. He began to whistle dismally through his teeth, watching the corner as it came nearer. The car stopped with a jerk. I'll go back, he said aloud, clambering down the steps. The truth was he had decided 5 minutes before when he first saw Janet's face. He walked briskly to his house, entirely refusing to waste any more energy on reflection. This is a business proposition, he told himself, and I'm going to handle it as such. Tibby was surprised to see him and offered him tea in vain. I'm just back for a few minutes. Let's see the letters. There was one from his wife. She proposed to stay another week at the Nuke Hydropathic and suggested that he might join her and bring her home. He sat down and wrote a long affectionate reply, declining, but expressing his delight that she was soon returning. That's very likely the last time Mama will hear from me, he reflected, but oddly enough, without any great fluttering of the heart. Then he proceeded to be furiously busy. He sent out Tibby to buy another knapsack and to order a cab and to cash a considerable check. In the knapsack he packed a fresh change of clothing and the new safety razor, but no books, for he was past the need of them. That done, he drove to his solicitors. What like a firm are Glendonan and Spears in Edinburgh? He asked the senior partner. Oh, very respectable. Very respectable indeed. Regular Edinburgh WS lot. Do a lot of factoring. I want you to telephone through to them and inquire about a place in Carrick called Huntington, near the village of Doutcarter. I understand it's to let, and I'm thinking of taking a lease of it. The senior partner after some delay got through to Edinburgh, and was presently engaged in the feverish dialectic which the long-distance telephone involves. I want to speak to Mr. Glendonan himself. Yes, Mr. Core of Pattern and Linklater. Good afternoon. Huntington. Yes, in Carrick. Not to let? But I understand it's been in the market for some months. You say you've an idea it has just been let. But my client is positive that you're mistaken, unless the agreement was made this morning. You'll inquire? Oh, I see. The actual factoring is done by your local agent. Mr. James Loudon, in Auchenlaken. You think my client had better get into touch with him at once? Just wait a minute, please. He put his hand over the receiver. Usual Edinburgh way of doing business, he observed caustically. What do you want done? I'll run down and see this Loudon. Tell Glendonan and Spears to advise him to expect me, for I'll go this very day. Mr. Core resumed his conversation. My client would like a telegram sent at once to Mr. Loudon introducing him. He's Mr. Dickson McCunn of Mearn Street, the great provision merchant, you know. Oh, yes. Good for any rent. Refer if you like to the Strathclyde Bank, but you can take my word for it. Thank you. Then that's settled. Goodbye. Dickson's next visit was to a gunmaker who was a fellow elder with him in the Guthrie Memorial Kirk. "I want a pistol and a lot of cartridges," he announced. "I'm not caring what kind it is, so long as it is a good one and not too big." "For yourself?" the gunmaker asked. "You must have a license, I doubt, and there's a lot of new regulations." "I can't wait on a license. It's for a cousin of mine who's off to Mexico at once." "You've got to find some way of obliging an old friend, Mr. McNair." Mr. McNair scratched his head. "I don't see how I can sell you one. But I'll tell you what I'll do, I'll lend you one. It belongs to my nephew, Peter Tate, and has been lying in a drawer ever since he came back from the front. He has no use for it now that he's a placed minister." So Dickson bestowed in the pockets of his waterproof a service revolver and 50 cartridges, and bade his cab take him to the shop in Mearns Street. For a moment the sight of the familiar place struck a pang to his breast, but he choked down unavailing regrets. He ordered a great hamper of foodstuffs, the most delicate kind of tinned goods, 2 perfect hams, tongues, Strasbourg pies, chocolate, cakes, biscuits and, as a last thought, 6 bottles of old liqueur brandy. It was to be carefully packed, addressed to Mrs. Moran, Dalcarter Station, and delivered in time for him to take down by the 7:33 train. Then he drove to the terminus and dined with something like a desperate peace in his heart. On this occasion he took a first-class ticket, for he wanted to be alone. As the lights began to be lit in the wayside stations and the clear April dusk darkened into night, his thoughts were somber yet resigned. He opened the window and let the sharp air of the Renfrewshire uplands fill the carriage. It was fine weather again after the rain, and a bright constellation, perhaps Dougal's friend O'Brien, hung in the western sky. How happy he would have been a week ago had he been starting thus for a country holiday. He could sniff the faint scent of moor, burn and ploughed earth which had always been his first reminder of spring. But he had been pitchforked out of that old happy world and could never enter it again. Alas! For the roadside fire, the cosy inn, the complete angler, the chavender or chub. And yet, he had done the right thing, though the Lord alone knew how it would end. He began to pluck courage from his very melancholy and hope from his reflections upon the transitoriness of life. He was austerely following romance as he conceived it, and if that capricious lady had taken one dream from him she might yet reward him with a better. Tags of poetry came into his head which seemed to favour this philosophy, particularly some lines of Browning on which he used to discourse to his Kirk Literary Society. Uncommon silly, he considered, these homilies of his must have been, mere twitterings of the unfledged. But now he saw more in the lines, a deeper interpretation which he had earned the right to make. O, world, where all things change and naught abides. O, life, the long mutation, is it so? Is it with life as with the body's change? Where, in no better follow, good must pass. That was as far as he could get, though he cudgelled his memory to continue. Moralizing thus, he became drowsy, and was almost asleep when the train drew up at the station of Kirkmichael. Chapter 7. Sundry doings in the murk. From Kirkmichael on the train stopped at every station, but no passenger seemed to leave or arrive at the little platforms white in the moon. At Dalcarter the case of provisions was safely transferred to the porter with instructions to take charge of it till it was sent for. During the next 10 minutes Dickson's mind began to work upon his problem with a certain briskness. It was all nonsense that the law of Scotland could not be summoned to the defence. The jewels had been safely got rid of, and who was to dispute their possession? Not Dobson and his crew, who had no sort of title, and were out for naked robbery. The girl had spoken of greater dangers from new enemies, kidnapping perhaps. Well, that was felony, and the police must be brought in. Probably if all were known the 3 watchers had criminal records, pages long, filed at Scotland Yard. The man to deal with that side of the business was Loudon the factor, and to him he was bound in the first place. He had made a clear picture in his head of this Loudon, a derelict old country writer, formal, pedantic, lazy, anxious only to get an unprofitable business off his hands with the least possible trouble, never going near the place himself, and ably supported in his lethargy by conceited Edinburgh writers to the signet. "Sich notions of business," he murmured. "I wonder that there's a single county family in Scotland no in the bankruptcy court." It was his mission to wake up Mr. James Loudon. Arrived at Auchenlaken, he went first to the Salutation Hotel, a pretentious place sacred to golfers. There he engaged a bedroom for the night and, having certain scruples, paid for it in advance. He also had some sandwiches prepared which he stowed in his pack, and filled his flask with whiskey. "I'm going home to Glasgow by the first train tomorrow," he told the landlady, "and now I've got to see a friend. I'll not be back till late." He was assured that there would be no difficulty about his admittance at any hour, and directed how to find Mr. Loudon's dwelling. It was an old house fronting direct on the street, with a fanlight above the door and a neat brass plate bearing the legend Mr. James Loudon, writer. A lane ran up one side leading apparently to a garden, for the moonlight showed the dusk of trees. In front was the main street of Auchenlaken, now deserted save for a single roisterer, and opposite stood the ancient town house, with arches where the country folk came at the spring and autumn hiring fairs. Dickson rang the antiquated bell, and was presently admitted to a dark hall floored with oil cloth, where a single gas jet showed that on one side was the business office and on the other the living rooms. Mr. Loudon was at supper, he was told, and he sent in his card. Almost at once the door at the end on the left side was flung open and a large figure appeared flourishing a napkin. "Come in, sir, come in," it cried. "I've just finished a bite of meat. Very glad to see you. Here, Maggie, what do you mean by keeping the gentleman standing in that outer darkness?" The room into which Dickson was ushered was small and bright, with a red paper on the walls, a fire burning and a big oil lamp in the center of a table. Clearly Mr. Loudon had no wife, for it was a bachelor's den in every line of it. A cloth was laid on a corner of the table, on which stood the remnants of a meal. Mr. Loudon seemed to have been about to make a brew of punch, for a kettle simmered by the fire, and lemons and sugar flanked a pot-bellied whiskey decanter of the type that used to be known as a mason's mell. The sight of the lawyer was a surprise to Dickson and dissipated his notions of an aged and lethargic incompetent. Mr. Loudon was a strongly built man who could not be a year over 50. He had a ruddy face, clean shaven except for a grizzled moustache. His grizzled hair was thinning round the temples, but his skin was unwrinkled and his eyes had all the vigor of youth. His tweed suit was well cut, and the buff waistcoat with flaps and pockets and the plain leather watchguard hinted at the sportsman, as did the half-dozen racing prints on the wall. A pleasant high-colored figure he made, his voice had the frank ring due to much use out of doors, and his expression had the singular candor which comes from grey eyes with large pupils and a narrow iris. "Sit down, Mr. McCunn. Take the arm-chair by the fire. I've had a wire from Glendonan and Spears about you. I was just going to have a glass of toddy, a grand thing for these uncertain April nights. You'll join me? No? Well, you'll smoke anyway. There's cigars at your elbow. Certainly, a pipe if you like. This is Liberty Hall." Dickson found some difficulty in the part for which he had cast himself. He had expected to condescend upon an elderly inept and give him sharp instructions. Instead he found himself faced with a jovial, virile figure which certainly did not suggest incompetence. It has been mentioned already that he had always great difficulty in looking anyone in the face, and this difficulty was intensified when he found himself confronted with bold and candid eyes. He felt abashed and a little nervous. "I've come to see you about Huntington House," he began. "I know. Sir Glendonan's informed me." "Well, I'm very glad to hear it. The place has been standing empty far too long, and that is worse for a new house than an old house. There's not much money to spend on it either, unless we can make sure of a good tenant. How did you hear about it?" I was taking a bit holiday and I spent a night at Doutcarter with an old auntie of mine. You must understand I've just retired from business, and I'm thinking of finding a country place. I used to have the big provision shop in Mearns Street, now the United Supply Stores, Limited. You've maybe heard of it. The other bowed and smiled. Who hasn't? The name of Dickson McCunn is known far beyond the city of Glasgow. Dickson was not insensible of the flattery, and he continued with more freedom. I took a walk and got a glisk of the house and I liked the look of it. You see, I want a quiet bit a good long way from a town, and at the same time a house with all modern conveniences. I suppose Huntington has that? When it was built 15 years ago it was considered a model, 6 bathrooms, its own electric light plant, steam heating, an independent boiler for hot water, the whole bag of tricks. I won't say but what some of these contrivances will want looking to, for the place has been some time empty, but there can be nothing very far wrong, and I can guarantee that the bones of the house are good. Well, that's all right, said Dickson. I don't mind spending a little money myself if the place suits me. But of that, of course, I'm not yet certain, for I've only had a glimpse of the outside. I wanted to get into the policies, but a man at the lodge wouldn't let me. They're a mighty uncivil lot down there. I'm very sorry to hear that, said Mr. Loudon in a tone of concern. And if I take the place I'll stipulate that you get rid of the lodge keepers. There won't be the slightest difficulty about that, for they are only weekly tenants. But I'm vexed to hear they were uncivil. I was glad to get any tenant that offered, and they were well recommended to me. They're foreigners. One of them is a Belgian refugee that Lady Morwood took an interest in. But the other, Spittal, they call him, I thought he was Scotch. He's not that. And I don't like the innkeeper either. I would want him shifted. Mr. Loudon laughed. I dare say Dobson is a rough diamond. There's worse folk in the world all the same, but I don't think he will want to stay. He only went there to pass the time till he heard from his brother in Vancouver. He's a roving spirit, and will be off overseas again. That's all right, said Dickson, who was beginning to have horrid suspicions that he might be on a wild goose chase after all. Well, the next thing is for me to see over the house. Certainly. I'd like to go with you myself. What day would suit you? Let me see. This is Friday. What about this day week? I was thinking of tomorrow. Since I'm down in these parts one may as well get the job done. Mr. Loudon looked puzzled. I quite see that. But I don't think it's possible. You see, I have to consult the owners and get their consent to a lease. Of course they have the general purpose of letting, but well, they're queer folk the Kennedys, and his face wore the half-embarrassed smile of an honest man preparing to make confidences. When poor Mr. Quentin died, the place went to his 2 sisters in joint ownership. A very bad arrangement, as you can imagine. It isn't entailed, and I've always been pressing them to sell, but so far they won't hear of it. They both married Englishmen, so it will take a day or 2 to get in touch with them. One, Mrs. Stukely, lives in Devonshire. The other, Miss Katie that was married Sir Francis Morwood, the General, and I hear that she's expected back in London next Monday from the Riviera. I'll wire and write first thing tomorrow morning. But you must give me a day or 2. Dickson felt himself waking up. His doubts about his own sanity were dissolving, for, as his mind reasoned, the factor was prepared to do anything he asked, but only after a week had gone. What he was concerned with was the next few days. All the same, I would like to have a look at the place tomorrow, even if nothing comes of it. Mr. Loudon looked seriously perplexed. You will think me absurdly fussy, Mr. McCunn, but I must really beg of you to give up the idea. The Kennedys, as I have said, are, well, not exactly like other people, and I have the strictest orders not to let anyone visit the house without their express leave. It sounds a ridiculous rule, but I assure you it's as much as my job is worth to disregard it. Do you mean to say not a soul is allowed inside the house? Not a soul. Well, Mr. Loudon, I'm going to tell you a queer thing, which I think you ought to know. When I was taking a walk the other night, your Belgian wouldn't let me into the policies, but I went down the glen, what's that they call it? The Garpaldine. I got round the back where the old ruin stands and I had a good look at the house. I tell you there was somebody in it. It would be Spittal, who acts as caretaker. It was not. It was a woman. I saw her on the veranda. The candid grey eyes were looking straight at Dickson, who managed to bring his own shy orbs to meet them. He thought that he detected a shade of hesitation. Then Mr. Loudon got up from his chair and stood on the hearthrug looking down at his visitor. He laughed, with some embarrassment, but ever so pleasantly. I really don't know what you will think of me, Mr. McCunn. Here are you, coming to do us all a kindness, unleash that infernal white elephant, and here have I been steadily hoaxing you for the last 5 minutes. I humbly ask your pardon. Set it down to the loyalty of an old family lawyer. Now, I am going to tell you the truth and take you into our confidence, for I know we are safe with you. The Kennedys are always have been just a wee bit queer. Old inbred stock, you know. They will produce somebody like poor Mr. Quentin, who was as sane as you or me, but as a rule in every generation there is one member of the family or more who is just a little bit, and he tapped his forehead. Nothing violent, you understand, but just not quite wise and world-like, as the old folk say. Well, there's a certain old lady, an aunt of Mr. Quentin and his sisters, who has always been about 10p in the shilling. Usually she lives at Bournemouth, but one of her crazes is a passion for Huntington, and the Kennedys have always humoured her and had her to stay every spring. When the house was shut up that became impossible, but this year she took such a craving to come back, that Lady Morwood asked me to arrange it. It had to be kept very quiet, but the poor old thing is perfectly harmless, and just sits and knits with her maid and looks out of the seaward windows. Now you see why I can't take you there tomorrow. I have to get rid of the old lady, who in any case was travelling south early next week. Do you understand? Perfectly, said Dickson with some fervour. He had learned exactly what he wanted. The factor was telling him lies. Now he knew where to place Mr. Loudon. He always looked back upon what followed as a very creditable piece of play, acting for a man who had small experience in that line. Is the old lady a wee wizened body, with a black cap and something like a white cashmere shawl round her shoulders? You describe her exactly, Mr. Loudon replied eagerly. That would explain the foreigners. Of course. We couldn't have natives who would make the thing the clash of the countryside. Of course not. But it must be a difficult job to keep a business like that quiet. Any wandering policeman might start inquiries. And supposing the lady became violent? Oh, there's no fear of that. Besides, I've a position in this county, deputy fiscal and so forth, and a friend of the chief constable. I think I may be trusted to do a little private explaining if the need arose. I see, said Dickson. He saw, indeed, a great deal which would give him food for furious thought. Well, I must just possess my soul in patience. Here's my Glasgow address, and I look to you to send me a telegram whenever you're ready for me. I'm at the Salutation tonight, and go home tomorrow with the first train. Wait a minute, and he pulled out his watch. There's a train stops at Auchenlaken at 10:17. I think I'll catch that. Well, Mr. Loudon, I'm very much obliged to you, and I'm glad to think that it'll not be long till we renew our acquaintance. The factor accompanied him to the door, diffusing geniality. Very pleased indeed to have met you. A pleasant journey and a quick return. The street was still empty. Into a corner of the arches opposite the moon was shining, and Dickson retired thither to consult his map of the neighborhood. He found what he wanted and, as he lifted his eyes, caught sight of a man coming down the causeway. Promptly he retired into the shadow and watched the newcomer. There could be no mistake about the figure, the bulk, the walk, the carriage of the head marked it for Dobson. The innkeeper went slowly past the factor's house, then halted and retraced his steps, then, making sure that the street was empty, turned into the side lane which led to the garden. This was what sailors call a cross-bearing, and strengthened Dickson's conviction. He delayed no longer, but hurried down the side street by which the north road leaves the town. He had crossed the bridge of Locan and was climbing the steep ascent which led to the heathy plateau separating that stream from the Garple before he had got his mind quite clear on the case. First, Loudon was in the plot, whatever it was, responsible for the details of the girl's imprisonment, but not the main author. That must be the unknown who was still to come, from whom Speidel took his orders. Dobson was probably Loudon's special henchman, working directly under him. Secondly, the immediate object had been the jewels, and they were happily safe in the vaults of the incorruptible Mackintosh. But, third, and this only on Saskia's evidence, the worst danger to her began with the arrival of the unknown. What could that be? Probably, kidnapping. He was prepared to believe anything of people like Bolsheviks. And, fourth, this danger was due within the next day or two. Loudon had been quite willing to let him into the house and to sack all the watchers within a week from that date. The natural and right thing was to summon the aid of the law, but fifth, that would be a slow business with Loudon able to put spokes in the wheels and befog the authorities, and the mischief would be done before a single policeman showed his face in Doutcarter. Therefore, sixth, he and Heritage must hold the fort in the meantime, and he would send a wire to his lawyer, Mr. Corr, to get to work with the constabulary. Seventh, he himself was probably free from suspicion in both Loudon's and Dobson's minds as a harmless fool. But that freedom would not survive his reappearance in Doutcarter. He could say, to be sure, that he had come back to see his auntie, but that would not satisfy the watchers, since, so far as they knew, he was the only man outside the gang who was aware that people were dwelling in the house. They would not tolerate his presence in the neighborhood. He formulated his conclusions as if it were an ordinary business deal, and rather to his surprise was not conscious of any fear. As he pulled together the belt of his waterproof he felt the reassuring bulges in its pockets which were his pistol and cartridges. He reflected that it must be very difficult to miss with a pistol if you fired it at, say, 3 yards, and if there was to be shooting that would be his range. Mr. McCunn had stumbled on the precious truth that the best way to be rid of quaking knees is to keep a busy mind. He crossed the ridge of the plateau and looked down on the Garple Glen. There were the lights of Doutcarter, or rather a single light, for the inhabitants went early to bed. His intention was to seek quarters with Mrs. Moran, when his eye caught a gleam in a hollow of the moor a little to the east. He knew it for the camp fire around which Dougal's warriors bivouacked. The notion came to him to go there instead, and hear the news of the day before entering the cottage. So he crossed the bridge, skirted a plantation of firs, and scrambled through the broom and heather in what he took to be the right direction. The moon had gone down, and the quest was not easy. Dickson had come to the conclusion that he was on the wrong road, when he was summoned by a voice which seemed to arise out of the ground. "Who goes there? What's that you say? Who goes there?" The point of a pole was held firmly against his chest. "I'm Mr. McCunn, a friend of Dougal's." "Stand, friend." The shadow before him whistled and another shadow appeared. "Report to the chief that there's a man here, name McCunn, seek in for him." Presently the messenger returned with Dougal and a cheap lantern which he flashed in Dickson's face. "Oh, it's you," said that leader, who had his jaw bound up as if he had the toothache. "What are you doing back here?" "To tell the truth, Dougal," was the answer, "I couldn't stay away. I was fair miserable when I thought of Mr. Heritage and you laddies left to yourselves. My conscience simply wouldn't let me stop at home, so here I am." Dougal grunted, but clearly he approved, for from that moment he treated Dickson with a new respect. Formerly when he had referred to him at all it had been as Old McCunn. Now it was Mr. McCunn. He was given rank as a worthy civilian ally. The bivouac was a cheerful place in the wet night. A great fire of pine roots and old paling posts hissed in the fine rain, and around it crouched several urchins busy making oatmeal cakes in the embers. On one side a respectable lean-to had been constructed by nailing a plank to 2 fir trees, running sloping poles thence to the ground, and thatching the whole with spruce branches and heather. On the other side 2 small dilapidated home-made tents were pitched. Dougal motioned his companion into the lean-to, where they had some privacy from the rest of the band. "Well, what's your news?" Dickson asked. He noticed that the chieftain seemed to have been comprehensively in the wars, for apart from the bandage on his jaw, he had numerous small cuts on his brow, and a great rent in one of his shirt sleeves. Also he appeared to be going lame, and when he spoke a new gap was revealed in his large teeth. "Things," said Dougal solemnly, "has come to a bonny crisis. This very night we've been in a battle." He spat fiercely, and the light of war burned in his eyes. "It was the tinklers from the Garpledine. They yoke it on us about 7 o'clock, just at the darkening. First they tried to bounce us. We weren't wanted here, they said, so we'd better clear. I telled them that it was them that wasn't wanted. Oh, out of fin neck, says I, do ye think we take our orders from dirty ne'er-do-wheels like you? By God, says they, we'll cut your lights out, and then the battle started." "What happened?" Dickson asked excitedly. "They were 4 muckle men against 6 laddies, and they thought they had an easy job. Little they kenned the Gorbals dive hards. I had been expecting something of the kind, and had made my plans. They first tried to PU down our tents and burn them. I let them get within 5 yards, reserving my fire. The first volley stones from our hands and our catties halted them, and before they could recover 3 of us had got hold o' burning sticks frae the fire and were lamming into them. We kindled their clays, and they fell back swearing and stamping to get the fire out. Then I gave the word and we were on them WIR poles, using the points according to instructions. My orders was to keep a good distance, for if they had grip pit one o' us he'd ha' been done for. They were roaring mad by now, and twa had out their knives, but they couldn't do muckle, for it was getting dark, and they didn't ken the ground like us, and were I tripping and tumbling. But they pressed us hard, and one o' them landed me an awful clipe on the jaw. They were still aiming at our tents, and I saw that if they got near the fire again it would be the end o' us. So I blew my whistle for Thomas Yawney, who was in command o' the other half of us, with instructions to fall upon their rear. That brought Thomas up, and the tinklers had to face round about and fight a battle on 2 fronts. We charged them and they broke, and the last seen o' them they were cooling their burns in the Garple. Well done, man. Had you many casualties? We're a wee thing battered, but nothing to hurt. I'm the worst, for one o' them had a grip o' me for about 3 seconds, and gosh! He was fierce. They're beaten off for the night, anyway. For the night. But they'll come back, never fear. That's why I said that things had come to a crisis. What's the news from the house? A quiet day, and no word o' Lean or Dobson. Dickson nodded. They were hunting me. Mr. Heritage has gone to bide in the Hoos. They were watching the Garpledine, so I took him round by the lava foot and up the rocks. He's a grand climber, yon. We found a road up the rocks and got in by the verandy. Did ye ken that the lassie had a pistol? Well, she has, and it seems that Mr. Heritage is a good shot wi' a pistol, so there's some hope there aways. Are the jewels safe? Safe in the bank. But the jewels were not the main thing. Dougal nodded. So I was thinking. The lassie wasn't muckle the easier for getting rid o' them. I didn't just quite understand what she said to Mr. Heritage, for they were I wandering into foreign languages, but it seems she's terrible feared o' somebody that may turn up any moment. What's the reason I can't say? She's maybe got a secret, or maybe it's just that she's our Bonnie. That's the trouble, said Dickson, and proceeded to recount his interview with the factor, to which Dougal gave close attention. Now the way I read the thing is this. There's a plot to kidnap that lady, for some infernal purpose, and it depends on the arrival of some person or persons, and it's due to happen in the next day or two. If we try to work it through the police alone, they'll beat us, for Loudon will manage to hang the business up till it's too late. So we must take up the job ourselves. We must stand a siege, Mr. Heritage and me and you laddies, and for that purpose we'd better all keep together. It won't be extra easy to carry her off from all of us, and if they do manage it will stick to their heels. Man, Dougal, isn't it a queer thing that whiles law-abiding folk have to make their own laws? So my plan is that the lot of us get into the house and form a garrison. If you don't, the tinklers will come back and you'll no beat them in the daylight. I doubt no, said Dougal. But what about our meat? We must lay in provisions. We'll get what we can from Mrs. Moran, and I've left a big box of fancy things at Doutcarter Station. Can you laddies manage to get it down here? Dougal reflected. We can hire Mrs. Sempill's pony, the same that fetched our kit. Well, that's your job tomorrow. See, I'll write you a line to the station, master. And will you undertake to get it some way into the house? There's just the one road open, by the rocks. It'll have to be done. It can be done. And I've another job. I'm writing this telegram to a friend in Glasgow who will put a spoke in Mr. Loudon's wheel. I want one of you to go to Kirkmichael to send it from the telegraph office there. Dougal placed the wire to Mr. Core in his bosom. What about yourself? We want somebody outside to keep his eyes open. It's bad strategy to cut off your communications. Dickson thought for a moment. I believe you're right. I believe the best plan for me is to go back to Mrs. Moran's as soon as the old bodies like to be awake. You can always get at me there, for it's easy to slip into her back kitchen without anybody in the village seeing you. Yes, I'll do that, and you'll come and report developments to me. And now I'm for a bite and a pipe. It's hungry work travelling the country in the small hours. I'm going to introduce you to the rest o' us, said Dougal. Here, men, he called, and 4 figures rose from the side of the fire. As Dickson munched a sandwich he passed in review the whole company of the Gorbals Die-Hards, for the pickets were also brought in, 2 others taking their places. There was Thomas Yaunai, the chief of staff, with a wrist wound up in the handkerchief which he had borrowed from his neck. There was a burly lad who wore trousers much too large for him, and who was known as Pierre Son, a contraction presumably for Peter Patterson. After him came a lean tall boy who answered to the name of Napoleon. There was a midget of a child, desperately sooty in the face either from battle or from fire, tending, who was presented as wee Jakey. Last came the picket who had held his pole at Dickson's chest, a sandy-haired warrior with a snub nose and the mouth and jaw of a pug dog. He was Old Bill, or in Dougal's parlance Old Bull. The chieftain viewed his scarred following with a grim content. That's a tough lot for ye, Mr. McCunn. Used to their days wi sleeping in coal-rees and dunnies and dodging the police. You'll no beat the Gorbals Die-Hards. You're right, Dougal, said Dickson. There's just the 6 of you. If there were a dozen, I think this country would be needing some new kind of a government. Chapter 8. How a middle-aged crusader accepted a challenge. The first cocks had just begun to crow and the clocks had not yet struck 5 when Dickson presented himself at Mrs. Moran's back door. That active woman had already been half an hour out of bed, and was drinking her morning cup of tea in the kitchen. She received him with cordiality, nay, with relief. Sirs, but I'm glad to see ye back. Gid kens what's gone on at the Whosday days. Mr. Heritage left here yestreen, creeping round by dyke, sides and berry, busses like a weasel. It's a mercy to get a responsible man in the place. I had a notion you would come back, for, thinks I, never Dickson is no the yin to desert folk in trouble. War's my weakest, lost, ye say. That's a pity, for it's been my cheese box they 30 year. Dickson ascended to the loft, having announced his need of at least 3 hours sleep. As he rolled into bed his mind was curiously at ease. He felt equipped for any call that might be made on him. That Mrs. Moran should welcome him back as a resource in need gave him a new assurance of manhood. He woke between 9 and 10 to the sound of rain lashing against the garret window. As he picked his way out of the mazes of sleep and recovered the skein of his immediate past, he found to his disgust that he had lost his composure. All the flock of fears that had left him when, on the top of the Glasgow tram car, he had made the great decision had flown back again and settled like black crows on his spirit. He was running a horrible risk and all for a whim. What business had he to be mixing himself up in things he did not understand? It might be a huge mistake, and then he would be a laughingstock. For a moment he repented his telegram to Mr. Core. Then he recanted that suspicion. There could be no mistake, except the fatal one that he had taken on a job too big for him. He sat on the edge of his bed and shivered, with his eyes on the grey drift of rain. He would have felt more stout-hearted had the sun been shining. He shuffled to the window and looked out. There in the village street was Dobson, and Dobson saw him. That was a bad blunder, for his reason told him that he should have kept his presence in Dalkeith hid as long as possible. There was a knock at the cottage door, and presently Mrs. Moran appeared. "It's the man frae the inn," she announced. "He's wanting a word wi'. Speaking vera civil, too." "Tell him to come up," said Dickson. He might as well get the interview over. Dobson had seen Loudon and must know of their conversation. The sight of himself back again when he had pretended to be off to Glasgow would remove him effectually from the class of the unsuspected. He wondered just what line Dobson would take. The innkeeper obtruded his bulk through the low door. His face was wrinkled into a smile, which nevertheless left the small eyes ungenial. His voice had a loud vulgar cordiality. Suddenly Dickson was conscious of a resemblance to somebody whom he had recently seen. It was Loudon. There was the same thrusting of the chin forward, the same odd cheek bones, the same unctuous heartiness of speech. The innkeeper, well-washed and polished and dressed, would be no bad copy of the factor. They must be near kin, perhaps brothers. "Good morning to you, Mr. McCunn. Man, it's pitiful weather, and just when the farmers are wanting a dry seed bed. What brings ye back here? Ye travel the country like a drover." "Oh, I'm a free man now and I took a fancy to this place. An idle body has nothing to do but please himself. I hear ye retaking a lease of Huntington. Now who told you that?" "Just the clash of the place. Is it true?" Dickson looked sly and a little annoyed. "I maybe had half a thought of it, but I'll thank you not to repeat the story. It's a big house for a plain man like me, and I haven't properly inspected it." "Oh, I'll keep mum, never fear. But if you've that sort of notion, I can understand you not being able to keep away from the place." "That's maybe the fact," Dickson admitted. "Well, it's just on that point I want a word with you." The innkeeper seated himself unbidden on the chair which held Dickson's modest raiment. He leaned forward and with a coarse forefinger tapped Dickson's pyjama-clad knees. "I can't have you wandering about the place. I'm very sorry, but I've got my orders from Mr. Loudon. So if you think that by bidding here ye can see more of the house and the policies, ye're wrong, Mr. McCunn. It can't be allowed, for we're no ready for ye yet. Do ye understand? That's Mr. Loudon's orders. Now, would it not be a far better plan if you went back to Glasgow and came back in a week's time? I'm thinking of your own comfort, Mr. McCunn." Dickson was cogitating hard. This man was clearly instructed to get rid of him at all costs for the next few days. The neighborhood had to be cleared for some black business. The tinklers had been deputed to drive out the Gorbals die-hards, and as for heritage, they seemed to have lost track of him. He, Dickson, was now the chief object of their care. But what could Dobson do if he refused? He dared not show his true hand. Yet he might, if sufficiently irritated. It became Dickson's immediate object to get the innkeeper to reveal himself by rousing his temper. He did not stop to consider the policy of this course. He imperatively wanted things cleared up and the issue made plain. "I'm sure I'm much obliged to you for thinking so much about my comfort," he said in a voice into which he hoped he had insinuated a sneer. "But I'm bound to say you're awful suspicious folk about here. You needn't be feared for your old policies. There's plenty of nice walks about the roads, and I want to explore the sea coast." The last words seemed to annoy the innkeeper. "That's no allowed either," he said. "The shore's as private as the policies. Well, I wish ye joy tramping the roads in the glaw." "It's a queer thing," said Dickson meditatively, "that you should keep an hotel and yet be set on discouraging people from visiting this neighborhood. I tell you what, I believe that hotel of yours is all sham. You've some other business, you and these lodge-keepers, and in my opinion it's not a very creditable one." "What do ye mean?" asked Dobson sharply. "Just what I say. You must expect a body to be suspicious, if you treat him as you're treating me." Loudon must have told this man the story with which he had been fobbed off about the half-witted Kennedy relative. Would Dobson refer to that? The innkeeper had an ugly look on his face, but he controlled his temper with an effort. "There's no cause for suspicion," he said. "As far as I'm concerned, it's all honest and above board." "It doesn't look like it. It looks as if you were hiding something up in the house which you don't want me to see." Dobson jumped from his chair, his face pale with anger. A man in pajamas on a raw morning does not feel at his bravest, and Dickson quailed under the expectation of assault. But even in his fright he realized that Loudon could not have told Dobson the tale of the half-witted lady. The last remark had cut clean through all camouflage and reached the quick. "What the hell do ye mean?" he cried. "Ye're a spy, are ye? Ye fat little fool, for 2 cents I'd wring your neck." Now it is an odd trait of certain mild people that a suspicion of threat, a hint of bullying, will rouse some unsuspected obstinacy deep down in their souls. The insolence of the man's speech woke a quiet but efficient little devil in Dickson. "That's a bonny tone to adopt in addressing a gentleman. If you've nothing to hide, what way are you so touchy? I can't be a spy unless there's something to spy on." The innkeeper pulled himself together. He was apparently acting on instructions, and had not yet come to the end of them. He made an attempt at a smile. "I'm sure I beg your pardon if I spoke too hot. But it nettled me to hear ye say that. I'll be quite frank with ye, Mr. McCunn, and, believe me, I'm speaking in your best interests. I give ye my word there's nothing wrong up at the house. I'm on the side of the law, and when I tell ye the whole story you'll admit it. But I can't tell it ye yet. This is a wild, lonely bit and very few folk bide in it. And these are wild times, when a lot of queer things happen that never get into the papers. I tell ye it's for your own good to leave Doubtharter for the present. More I can't say, but I ask ye to look at it as a sensible man. Ye're one that's accustomed to a quiet life and no meant for rough work. You'll do no good if you stay, and, maybe, you'll land yourself in bad trouble." "Mercy on us!" Dickson exclaimed. "What is it you're expecting? Sinn Fein?" The innkeeper nodded. "Something like that. Did you ever hear the like? I never did think much of the Irish." "Then you'll take my advice and go home. Tell you what, I'll drive you to the station." Dickson got up from the bed, found his new safety razor and began to strop it. "No, I think I'll bide. If you're right, there'll be more to see than glory roads. I'm warning ye, fair and honest. Ye can't be allowed to stay here. Well, I never, said Dickson. Is there any law in Scotland, think you, that forbids a man to stop a day or two with his auntie? You'll stay. I'll stay. By God, we'll see about that. For a moment Dickson thought that he would be attacked, and he measured the distance that separated him from the peg whence hung his waterproof with the pistol in its pocket. But the man restrained himself and moved to the door. There he stood and cursed him with a violence and a venom which Dickson had not believed possible. The full hand was on the table now. Ye wee pot-bellied, pig-hided Glasgow grocer, I paraphrase, would you set up to defy me? I tell ye, I'll make ye rue the day ye were born. His parting words were a brilliant sketch of the maltreatment in store for the body of the defiant one. Impudent dog, said Dickson without heat. He noted with pleasure that the innkeeper hit his head violently against the low lintel, and, missing a step, fell down the loft stairs into the kitchen, where Mrs. Moran's tongue could be heard speeding him trenchantly from the premises. Left to himself, Dickson dressed leisurely, and by went down to the kitchen and watched his hostess making broth. The fracas with Dobson had done him all the good in the world, for it had cleared the problem of dubieties and had put an edge on his temper. But he realized that it made his continued stay in the cottage undesirable. He was now the focus of all suspicion, and the innkeeper would be as good as his word and try to drive him out of the place by force. Kidnapping, most likely, and that would be highly unpleasant, besides putting an end to his usefulness. Clearly he must join the others. The soul of Dickson hungered at the moment for human companionship. He felt that his courage would be sufficient for any team work, but might waver again if he were left to play a lone hand. He lunched nobly off 3 plates of Mrs. Moran's kale, an early lunch, for that lady, having breakfasted at 5, partook of the midday meal about 11. Then he explored her library, and settled himself by the fire with a volume of Covenanting tales, entitled Gleanings Among the Mountains. It was a most practical work for one in his position, for it told how various eminent saints of that era escaped the attention of Claverhouse dragoons. Dickson stored up in his memory several of the incidents in case they should come in handy. He wondered if any of his forebears had been Covenanters. It comforted him to think that some old progenitor might have hunkered behind turf walls and been chased for his life in the heather. Just like me, he reflected. But the dragoons weren't foreigners, and there was a kind of decency about Claverhouse too. About 4 o'clock Dougal presented himself in the back kitchen. He was an even wilder figure than usual, for his bare legs were mud to the knees, his kilt and shirt clung sopping to his body, and, having lost his hat, his wet hair was plastered over his eyes. Mrs. Moran said, not unkindly, that he looked like a wool-cat glowering through a wind bus. "How are you, Dougal?" Dickson asked genially. "Is the peace of nature smoothing out the creases in your poor little soul?" "What's that ye say?" "Oh, just what I heard a man say in Glasgow." "How have you got on?" "Not so bad. Your telegram was sent this morning. Old Bill took it into Kirkmichael. That's the first thing. Second, Thomas Yanai has took a party to get down the box from the station. He got Mrs. Semple's pony and he took the box ayont the lava by the ford at the Herdshuis and got it onto the shore maybe a mile ayont Lavafoot. He managed to get the machine up as far as the water, but he could get no farther, for you'll no get a machine over the wee Waterford just before the lava ends in the sea. So he sent one o' the men back with it to Mrs. Semple, and, since the box was heavy to carry, he opened it and took the stuff across in bits. It's a safe in the hole at the foot o' the Huntington rocks, and he reports that the rain has done it no harm. Thomas has made a good job of it. You'll know fickle Thomas Yanai. And what about your camp on the moor? It was broke up afore daylight. Some of our things we've got with us, and most is hid near at hand. The tents are in the old wife's henhouse, and he jerked his disreputable head in the direction of the back door. Have the tinklers been back? Eh? They turned up about 10 o'clock, no doubt intending murder. I left wee Jakey to watch developments. They found him sitting on a stone, greeting sore. When he saw them, he up and started to run, and they cried on him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. Then they cried out where were the rest, and he told them they were feared for their lives and had run away. After that they offered to catch him, but you'll no catch Jakey in a hurry. When he had run round about them till they were whoppit, he out wi his catty and got one o' them on the lug. Sign he made for the lava-foot and reported. Man, Dougal, you've managed fine. Now I've something to tell you, and Dickson recounted his interview with the innkeeper. I don't think it's safe for me to bide here, and if I did, I wouldn't be any use, hiding in cellars and such like, and not daring to stir a foot. I'm coming with you to the house. Now tell me how to get there. Dougal agreed to this view. There's been nothing doing at the house the day, but they're keeping a close watch on the policies. The Krypus may come any moment. There's no doubt, Mr. McCunn, that ye re in danger, for they'll serve you as the tinklers tried to serve us. Listen to me. You'll walk up the station road, and take the second turn on your left, a wee grass road that'll bring ye to the ford at the herd's house. Cross the lava, there's a plank bridge, and take straight across the moor in the direction of the peakit hill they call Grey Carrick. You'll come to a big burn, which ye must follow till ye get to the shore. Then turn south, keeping the water's edge till ye reach the lava, where you'll find one o' us to show ye the rest of the road. I must be off now, and I advise ye not to be slow of starting, for this rain the water's risen quick. It's a mercy it's such coarse weather, for it spoils the visibility. Auntie Femi, said Dickson a few minutes later, will you oblige me by coming for a short walk? The man's daft, was the answer. I'm not. I'll explain if you'll listen. You see, he concluded, the dangerous bit for me is just the mile out of the village. They'll no be so likely to try violence if there's somebody with me that could be a witness. Besides, they'll maybe suspect less if they just see a decent body out for a breath of air with his auntie. Mrs. Moran said nothing, but retired, and returned presently equipped for the road. She had endued her feet with galoshes and pinned up her skirts till they looked like some demented Paris mode. An ancient bonnet was tied under her chin with strings, and her equipment was completed by an exceedingly smart tortoise shell-handled umbrella, which, she explained, had been a Christmas present from her son. I'll convoy ye as far as the Lavafoot herds, she announced. The wife's a friend o' mine and will set me a bit on the road back. Ye needna fash for me. I'm used to a weathers. The rain had declined to a fine drizzle, but a tearing wind from the south-west scoured the land. Beyond the shelter of the trees the moor was a battle-ground of gusts which swept the puddles into spindrift and gave to the stagnant bog pools the appearance of running water. The wind was behind the travellers, and Mrs. Moran, like a full-rigged ship, was hustled before it, so that Dickson, who had linked arms with her, was sometimes compelled to trot. "However will you get home, mistress?" he murmured anxiously. "Fine. The wind will fa at the darkening. This'll be a sad time for ships at sea." Not a soul was about, as they breasted the ascent of the station road and turned down the grassy bypath to the Lavafoot herds. The herd's wife saw them from afar and was at the door to receive them. "Megsty! Femi Moran," she shrilled. "What would ettle to see ye on a day like this? John Zawar at Dumfries, buyin' tups. Come in, the baith o' ye. The kettle's on the boil." "This is my nevo Dickson," said Mrs. Moran. "He's gone to stretch his legs ayont the burn, and come back by the air road. But I'll be blithe to tack my twi Elspeth. Now, Dickson, I'll expect ye back on the Chapo Seven." He crossed the rising stream on a swaying plank and struck into the moorland, as Dougal had ordered, keeping the bald top of grey carrick before him. In that wild place with the tempest battling overhead he had no fear of human enemies. Steadily he covered the ground, till he reached the west-flowing burn that was to lead him to the shore. He found it an entertaining companion, swirling into black pools, foaming over little falls, and lying in dark canal-like stretches in the flats. Presently it began to descend steeply in a narrow green gully, where the going was bad, and Dickson, weighted with pack and waterproof, had much ado to keep his feet on the sodden slopes. Then, as he rounded a crook of hill, the ground fell away from his feet, the burn swept in a water slide to the boulders of the shore, and the storm-tossed sea lay before him. It was now that he began to feel nervous. Being on the coast again seemed to bring him inside his enemy's territory, and had not Dobson specifically forbidden the shore? It was here that they might be looking for him. He felt himself out of condition, very wet and very warm, but he attained a creditable pace, for he struck a road which had been used by manure carts collecting seaweed. There were faint marks on it, which he took to be the wheels of Dougal's machine carrying the provision box. Yes. On a patch of gravel there was a double set of tracks, which showed how it had returned to Mrs. Sempill. He was exposed to the full force of the wind, and the strenuousness of his bodily exertions kept his fears quiescent, till the cliffs on his left sunk suddenly and the valley of the lava lay before him. A small figure rose from the shelter of a boulder, the warrior who bore the name of Old Bill. He saluted gravely. "Ye read just in time. The water has rose 3 inches since I've been here. Ye'd better strip." Dickson removed his boots and socks. "Breeks, too," commanded the boy, "there's deep holes ayont they stands." Dickson obeyed, feeling very chilly, and rather improper. "Now, follow me," said the guide. The next moment he was stepping delicately on very sharp pebbles, holding on to the end of the scout's pole, while an icy stream ran to his knees. The lava as it reaches the sea broadens out to the width of 50 or 60 yards and tumbles over little shelves of rock to meet the waves. Usually it is shallow, but now it was swollen to an average depth of a foot or more, and there were deeper pockets. Dickson made the passage slowly and miserably, sometimes crying out with pain as his toes struck a sharper flint, once or twice sitting down on a boulder to blow like a whale, once slipping on his knees and wetting the strange excrescence about his middle, which was his tucked-up waterproof. But the crossing was at length achieved, and on a patch of sea pinks he dried himself perfunctorily and hastily put on his garments. Old Bill, who seemed to be regardless of wind or water, squatted beside him and whistled through his teeth. Above them hung the sheer cliffs of the Huntington Cape, so sheer that a man below was completely hidden from any watcher on the top. Dickson's heart fell, for he did not profess to be a cragsman and had indeed a horror of precipitous places. But as the two scrambled along the foot, they passed deep-cut gullies and fissures, most of them unclimbable, but offering something more hopeful than the face. At one of these Old Bill halted and led the way up and over a chaos of fallen rock and loose sand. The grey weather had brought on the dark prematurely, and in the half-light it seemed that this ravine was blocked by an unscalable mass of rock. Here Old Bill whistled, and there was a reply from above. Round the corner of the mass came Dougal. "Up here," he commanded. It was Mr. Heritage that funded this road. Dickson and his guide squeezed themselves between the mass and the cliff up a spout of stones, and found themselves in an upper story of the gully, very steep but practicable even for one who was no cragsman. This in turn ran out against a wall up which there led only a narrow chimney. At the foot of this were 2 of the dive-hards, and there were others above, for a rope hung down by the aid of which a package was even now ascending. "That's the top," said Dougal, pointing to the rim of sky, "and that's the last o' the supplies." Dickson noticed that he spoke in a whisper, and that all the movements of the dive-hards were judicious and stealthy. "Now, it's your turn. Take a good grip o' the rope, and you'll find plenty holes for your feet. It's no more than 10 yards and ye well held above." Dickson made the attempt and found it easier than he expected. The only trouble was his pack and waterproof, which had a tendency to catch on jags of rock. A hand was reached out to him, he was pulled over the edge, and then pushed down on his face. When he lifted his head, Dougal and the others had joined him, and the whole company of the die-hards was assembled on a patch of grass which was concealed from the landward view by a thicket of hazels. Another, whom he recognized as Heritage, was coiling up the rope. "We'd better get all the stuff into the old tower for the present," Heritage was saying. "It's too risky to move it into the house now. We'll need the thickest darkness for that, after the moon is down. Quick, for the beastly thing will be rising soon, and before that we must all be indoors." Then he turned to Dickson, and gripped his hand. "You're a high class of sportsman, dog-son. And I think you're just in time." "Are they due tonight?" Dickson asked in an excited whisper, faint against the wind. "I don't know about they. But I've got a notion that some devilish queer things will happen before tomorrow morning." Chapter 9. The First Battle of the Cruives. The old keep of Huntington stood some 300 yards from the edge of the cliffs, a gnarled of hazels and oaks protecting it from the sea winds. It was still in fair preservation, having till 20 years before been an adjunct of the house of Dalcarter, and used as kitchen, buttery, and servants' quarters. There had been residential wings attached, dating from the mid-18th century, but these had been pulled down and used for the foundations of the new mansion. Now it stood a lonely shell, its 3 stories, each a single great room connected by a spiral stone staircase, being dedicated to lumber and the storage of produce. But it was dry and intact, its massive oak doors defied any weapon short of artillery, its narrow and glazed windows would scarcely have admitted a cat, a place portentously strong, gloomy, but yet habitable. Dougal opened the main door with a massy key. "The lassie fund it," he whispered to Dickson, "somewhere about the kitchen, and I guessed it was the key o' this castle. I was thinking that if things got hot it would be a good plan to flit here. Change our base, like." The chieftain's occasional studies in war had trained his tongue to a military jargon. In the ground room lay a fine assortment of oddments, including old bedsteads and servants' furniture, and what looked like ancient discarded deer skin rugs. Dust lay thick over everything, and they heard the scurry of rats. A dismal place, indeed, but Dickson felt only its strangeness. The comfort of being back again among allies had quickened his spirit to an adventurous mood. The old lords of Huntington had once quarrelled and revelled and plotted here, and now here he was at the same game. Present and past joined hands over the gulf of years. The saga of Huntington was not ended. The die-hards had brought with them their scanty bedding, their lanterns, and camp kettles. These and the provisions from Mern Street were stowed away in a corner. "Now for the who's, men," said Dougal. They stole over the downs to the shrubbery, and Dickson found himself almost in the same place as he had lain in 3 days before, watching a dusky lawn, while the wet earth soaked through his trouser knees and the drip from the azaleas trickled over his spine. 2 of the boys fetched the ladder and placed it against the veranda wall. Heritage first, then Dickson darted across the lawn and made the ascent. The 6 scouts followed, and the ladder was pulled up and hidden among the veranda litter. For a second the whole 8 stood still and listened. There was no sound except the murmur of the now falling wind and the melancholy hooting of owls. The garrison had entered the dark tower. A council in whispers was held in the garden room. "Nobody must show a light," Heritage observed. "It mustn't be known that we're here. Only the princess will have a lamp." "Yes," this in answer to Dickson, "she knows that we're coming, you two. We'll hunt for quarters later upstairs. You scouts, you must picket every possible entrance. The windows are safe, I think, for they are locked from the inside. So is the main door. But there's the veranda door, of which they have a key, and the back door beside the kitchen, and I'm not at all sure that there's not a way in by the boiler house. You understand. We're holding this place against all comers. We must barricade the danger points. The headquarters of the garrison will be in the hall, where a scout must be always on duty. You've all got whistles. Well, if there's an attempt on the veranda door, the picket will whistle once, if at the back door twice, if anywhere else 3 times, and it's everybody's duty, except the picket who whistles, to get back to the hall for orders. That's so, assented Dougal. If the enemy forces an entrance, we must overpower him. Any means you like. Sticks or fists, and remember that if it's a scrap in the dark, make for the man's throat. I expect you little devils have eyes like cats. The scoundrels must be kept away from the ladies at all costs. If the worst comes to the worst, the princess has a revolver. So have I, said Dickson. I got it in Glasgow. The deuce you have. Can you use it? I don't know. Well, you can hand it over to me, if you like. But it oughtn't to come to shooting, if it's only the 3 of them. The 8 of us should be able to manage 3 and 1 of them lame. If the others turn up, well, God help us all. But we've got to make sure of one thing, that no one lays hands on the princess so long as there's one of us left alive to hit out. Ye needn't be feared for that, said Dougal. There was no light in the room, but Dickson was certain that the morose face of the chieftain was lit with unholy joy. Then off with you. Mr. McCunn and I will explain matters to the ladies. When they were alone, Heritage's voice took a different key. We're in for it, dog-son, old man. There's no doubt these 3 scoundrels expect reinforcements at any moment, and with them will be one who is the devil incarnate. He's the only thing on earth that brave girl fears. It seems he is in love with her and has pestered her for years. She hated the sight of him, but he wouldn't take no, and being a powerful man, rich and well born and all the rest of it, she had a desperate time. I gather he was pretty high in favor with the old court. Then when the Bolsheviks started, he went over to them, like plenty of other grandees, and now has one of their chief brains, none of your callow revolutionaries, but a man of the world, a kind of genius, she says, who can hold his own anywhere. She believes him to be in this country, and only waiting the right moment to turn up. Oh, it sounds ridiculous, I know, in Britain in the 20th century, but I learned in the war that civilization anywhere is a very thin crust. There are 100 ways by which that kind of fellow could bamboozle all our law and police and spirit her away. That's the kind of crowd we have to face. Did she say what he was like in appearance? A face like an angel, a lost angel, she says. Dickson suddenly had an inspiration. Do you mind the man you said was an Australian, at Kirkmichael? I thought myself he was a foreigner. Well, he was asking for a place he called Darkwater, and there's no such place in the countryside. I believe he meant Dalkharter. I believe he's the man she's feared of. A gasp by Jove came from the darkness. Dog-son, you've hit it. That was 5 days ago, and he must have got on the right trail by this time. He'll be here tonight. That's why the 3 have been lying so quiet today. Well, we'll go through with it, even if we haven't a dog's chance. Only I'm sorry that you should be mixed up in such a hopeless business. Why me more than you? Because it's all pure pride and joy for me to be here. Good God, I wouldn't be elsewhere for worlds. It's the great hour of my life. I would gladly die for her. Tuts, that's no the way to talk, man. Time enough to speak about dying when there's no other way out. I'm looking at this thing in a business way. We'd better be seeing the ladies. They groped into the pitchy hall, somewhere in which a die-hard was on picket, and down the passage to the smoking room. Dickson blinked in the light of a very feeble lamp, and Heritage saw that his hands were cumbered with packages. He deposited them on a sofa and made a ducking bow. I've come back, Mem, I'm glad to be back. Your jewels are in safe keeping, and not all the blackguards in creation could get at them. I've come to tell you to cheer up, a stout heart to a stay brae, as the old folk say. I'm handling this affair as a business proposition, so don't be feared, Mem. If there are enemies seeking you, there's friends on the road too. Now, you'll have had your dinner, but you'd maybe like a little dessert. He spread before them a huge box of chocolates, the best that Man Street could produce, a box of candied fruits, and another of salted almonds. Then from his hideously overcrowded pockets he took another box, which he offered rather shyly. That's some powder for your complexion. They tell me that ladies find it useful whiles. The girl's strained face watched him at first in mystification, and then broke slowly into a smile. Youth came back to it, the smile changed to a laugh, a low rippling laugh like far-away bells. She took both his hands. You are kind, she said, you are kind and brave. You are a dear. And then she kissed him. Now, as far as Dickson could remember, no one had ever kissed him except his wife. The light touch of her lips on his forehead was like the pressing of an electric button which explodes some powerful charge and alters the face of a countryside. He blushed scarlet, then he wanted to cry, then he wanted to sing. An immense exhilaration seized him, and I am certain that if at that moment the serried ranks of Bolshevism had appeared in the doorway, Dickson would have hurled himself upon them with a joyful shout. Cousin Eugenie was earnestly eating chocolates, but Saskia had other business. You will hold the house? She asked. Please God, yes, said Heritage. I look at it this way. The time is very near when your three gaolers expect the others, their masters. They have not troubled you in the past 2 days as they threatened, because it was not worthwhile. But they won't want to let you out of their sight in the final hours, so they will almost certainly come here to be on the spot. Our object is to keep them out and confuse their plans. Somewhere in this neighborhood, probably very near, is the man you fear most. If we nonplus the 3 watchers, they'll have to revise their policy, and that means a delay, and every hour's delay is a gain. Mr. McCunn has found out that the factor Loudon is in the plot, and he has purchased enough, it seems, to blanket for a time any appeal to the law. But Mr. McCunn has taken steps to circumvent him, and in 24 hours we should have help here. I do not want the help of your law, the girl interrupted. It will entangle me. Not a bit of it, said Dickson cheerfully. You see, ma'am, they've clean lost track of the jewels, and nobody knows where they are but me. I'm a truthful man, but I'll lie like a packman if I'm asked questions. For the rest, it's a question of kidnapping, I understand, and that's a thing that's not to be allowed. My advice is to go to our beds and get a little sleep while there's a chance of it. The Gaubles die hards our grand watch dogs. This view sounded so reasonable that it was at once acted upon. The ladies' chamber was next door to the smoking room, what had been the old schoolroom. Heritage arranged with Saskia that the lamp was to be kept burning low, and that on no account were they to move unless summoned by him. Then he and Dickson made their way to the hall, where there was a faint glimmer from the moon in the upper unshuttered windows, enough to reveal the figure of wee Jakey on duty at the foot of the staircase. They ascended to the 2nd floor, where, in a large room above the hall, Heritage had bestowed his pack. He had managed to open a fold of the shutters, and there was sufficient light to see 2 big mahogany bedsteads without mattresses or bedclothes, and wardrobes, and chests of drawers sheeted in holland. Outside the wind was rising again, but the rain had stopped. Angry watery clouds scurried across the heavens. Dickson made a pillow of his waterproof, stretched himself on one of the bedsteads and, so quiet was his conscience and so weary his body from the buffetings of the past days, was almost instantly asleep. It seemed to him that he had scarcely closed his eyes when he was awakened by Dougal's hand pinching his shoulder. He gathered that the moon was setting, for the room was pitchy dark. The 3 o' them is approaching the kitchen door, whispered the chieftain. I seen them from a spy hole I made out o' a ventilator. Is it barricaded? Asked Heritage, who had apparently not been asleep. But I've thought o' a far better plan. Why should we keep them out? They'll be safer inside. Listen. We might manage to get them in one at a time. If they can't get in at the kitchen door, they'll send one o' them round to get in by another door and open to them. That gives us a chance to get them separated and lock them up. There's Vol.2 closets and hide holes all over the place, each with good doors and good keys to them. Supposin' we get the three o' them shut up, the others, when they come, will have nobody to guide them. Of course some time or other the three will break out, but it may be hour late for them. At present we're besieged and they'll roam in the country. Would it no be far better if they were the ones lock it up and we were going loose? Supposing they don't come in one at a time? Dickson objected. We'll make them, said Dougal firmly. There's no time to waste. Are ye for it? Yes, said Heritage. Who's at the kitchen door? Peter Patterson. I told him no to whistle, but to wait on me. Keep your boots off. Ye re better in your stocking feet. Wait you in the hall and see ye re well hidden, for likely whoever comes in will have a lantern. Just you keep quiet unless I give ye a cry. I've planned it out, and we're ready for them. Dougal disappeared, and Dickson and Heritage, with their boots tied round their necks by their laces, crept out to the upper landing. The hall was impenetrably dark, but full of voices, for the wind was talking in the ceiling beams, and murmuring through the long passages. The walls creaked and muttered and little bits of plaster fluttered down. The noise was an advantage for the game of hide and seek they proposed to play, but it made it hard to detect the enemy's approach. Dickson, in order to get properly wakened, adventured as far as the smoking room. It was black with night, but below the door of the adjacent room a faint line of light showed where the princess's lamp was burning. He advanced to the window, and heard distinctly a foot on the gravel path that led to the veranda. This sent him back to the hall in search of Dougal, whom he encountered in the passage. That boy could certainly see in the dark, for he caught Dickson's wrist without hesitation. We've got spittal in the wine cellar, he whispered triumphantly. The kitchen door was barricaded, and when they tried it, it wouldn't open. Bide here, says Dobson to Spittal, and we'll go round by another door and come back and open to ye. So off they went, and by that time Peter Patterson and me had the barricade down. As we expected, Spittal tried the key again and it opens quite easy. He comes in and locks it behind him, and, Dobson having took away the lantern, he gropes his way very carefully towards the kitchen. There's a point where the wine cellar door and the scullery door are aside each other. He should have taken the second, but I had it shut so he takes the first. Peter Patterson gave him a wee shove and he fell down the 2-3 steps into the cellar, and we turned the key on him. Yon cellar has a grand door and no windies. And Dobson and Leon are at the veranda door. With a light. Thomas Yowney's on duty there. Ye can trust him. Ye'll know fickle Thomas Yowney. The next minutes were for Dickson a delirium of excitement not unpleasantly shot with flashes of doubt and fear. As a child he had played hide and seek, and his memory had always cherished the delights of the game. But how marvelous to play it thus in a great empty house, at dark of night, with the heaven filled with tempest, and with death or wounds as the stakes. He took refuge in a corner where a tapestry curtain and the side of a Dutch ormery gave him shelter, and from where he stood he could see the garden room and the beginning of the tiled passage which led to the veranda door. That is to say, he could have seen these things if there had been any light, which there was not. He heard the soft flitting of bare feet, for a delicate sound is often audible in a din when a loud noise is obscured. Then a gale of wind blew towards him, as from an open door, and far away gleamed the flickering light of a lantern. Suddenly the light disappeared and there was a clatter on the floor and a breaking of glass. Either the wind or Thomas Yowney. The veranda door was shut, a match spluttered and the lantern was relit. Dobson and Leon came into the hall, both clad in long mackintoshes which glistened from the weather. Dobson halted and listened to the wind howling in the upper spaces. He cursed it bitterly, looked at his watch, and then made an observation which woke the liveliest interest in Dickson lurking beside the ormary and Heritage ensconced in the shadow of a window seat. "He's late. He should have been here 5-minute sign. It would be a dirty road for his car." So the unknown was coming that night. The news made Dickson the more resolved to get the watchers under lock and key before reinforcements arrived, and so put grit in their wheels. Then his party must escape, flee anywhere so long as it was far from Doubtcarter. "You stop here," said Dobson, "I'll go down and let Spidle in. We want another lamp. Get the one that the women use and for God's sake get a move on." The sound of his feet died in the kitchen passage and then rung again on the stone stairs. Dickson's ear of faith heard also the soft patter of naked feet as the die-hards proceeded and followed him. He was delivering himself blind and bound into their hands. For a minute or two there was no sound but the wind, which had found a loose chimney cowl on the roof and screwed out of it an odd sound like the drone of a bagpipe. Dickson, unable to remain any longer in one place, moved into the center of the hall, believing that Leon had gone to the smoking room. It was a dangerous thing to do, for suddenly a match was lit a yard from him. He had the sense to drop low, and so was out of the main glare of the light. The man with the match apparently had no more, judging by his execrations. Dickson stood stock still, longing for the wind to fall so that he might hear the sound of the fellow's boots on the stone floor. He gathered that they were moving towards the smoking room. "Heritage," he whispered as loud as he dared, but there was no answer. Then suddenly a moving body collided with him. He jumped a step back and then stood at attention. "Is that you, Dobson?" a voice asked. Now behold the occasional advantage of a nickname. Dickson thought he was being addressed as Dobson after the poet's fashion. Had he dreamed it was Leon he would not have replied, but fluttered off into the shadows and so missed a piece of vital news. "Hey, it's me," he whispered. His voice and accent were Scotch, like Dobson's, and Leon suspected nothing. "I do not like this wind," he grumbled. "The captain's letter said at dawn, but there is no chance of the Danish brig making your little harbor in this weather. She must lie off and land the men by boats. That I do not like. It is too public." The news, tremendous news, for it told that the newcomers would come by sea, which had never before entered Dickson's head, so interested him that he stood dumb and ruminating. The silence made the Belgian suspect. He put out a hand and felt a waterproofed arm which might have been Dobson's. But the height of the shoulder proved that it was not the burly innkeeper. There was an oath, a quick movement, and Dickson went down with a knee on his chest and 2 hands at his throat. "Heritage," he gasped. "Help!" There was a sound of furniture scraped violently on the floor. A gurgle from Dickson served as a guide, and the poet suddenly cascaded over the combatants. He felt for a head, found Leon's, and gripped the neck so savagely that the owner loosened his hold on Dickson. The last named found himself being buffeted violently by heavy, shod feet which seemed to be maneuvering before an unseen enemy. He rolled out of the road and encountered another pair of feet, this time unshod. Then came a sound of a concussion, as if metal or wood had struck some part of a human frame, and then a stumble and fall. After that a good many things all seemed to happen at once. There was a sudden light, which showed Leon blinking with a short loaded life preserver in his hand, and Heritage prone in front of him on the floor. It also showed Dickson the figure of Dougal, and more than one die hard in the background. The light went out as suddenly as it had appeared. There was a whistle, and a horse "Come on, men," and then for 2 seconds there was a desperate silent combat. It ended with Leon's head meeting the floor so violently that its possessor became oblivious of further proceedings. He was dragged into a cubby hole, which had once been used for coats and rugs, and the door locked on him. Then the light sprang forth again. It revealed Dougal and 5 die-hards, somewhat the worse for wear. It revealed also Dickson squatted with outspread waterproof very like a sitting hen. "Where's Dobson?" he asked. "In the boiler house," and for once Dougal's gravity had laughter in it. Govey Dick. But yon was a fecht. Me and Peter Patterson and wee Jakey started it, but it was the whole company afore the end. Are ye better, Jakey? I'm better, said a pallid midget. He kicked Jakey in the stomach and Jakey was sick, Dougal explained. That's the 3 accounted for. Now they're safe for 5 hours at the least. I think missile that Dobson will be the first to get out, but he'll have his work letting out the others. Now, I'm for flittin' to the old tower. They'll no ken where we are for a long time, and anyway yon place will be far easier to defend. Without they kindle a fire and smoke us out, I don't see how they'll beat us. Our provisions are there, and there's a grand well o' water inside. Forby there's the road down the rocks that'll keep our communications open. But what's come to Mr. Heritage? Dickson to his shame had forgotten all about his friend. The poet lay very quiet with his head on one side and his legs crooked limply. Blood trickled over his eyes from an ugly scar on his forehead. Dickson felt his heart and pulse and found them faint but regular. The man had got a swinging blow and might have a slight concussion. For the present he was unconscious. All the more reason why we should flit, said Dougal. What do ye say, Mr. McCunn? Flit, of course, but further than the old tower. What's the time? He lifted Heritage's wrist and saw from his watch that it was 3:30. Mercy! It's nearly morning. Afore we put these blackguards away, they were conversing, at least Leon and Dobson were. They said that they expected somebody every moment, but that the car would be late. We've still got that somebody to tackle. Then Leon spoke to me in the dark, thinking I was Dobson, and cursed the wind, saying it would keep the Danish brig from getting in at dawn as had been intended. Do you see what that means? The worst of the lot, the ones the ladies are in terror of, are coming by sea. And they can return by sea. We thought that the attack would be by land, and that even if they succeeded we could hang on to their heels and follow them, till we got them stopped. But that's impossible. If they come in from the water, they can go out by the water, and there'll never be more heard tell of the ladies or of you or me. Dougal's face was once again sunk in gloom. What's your plan, then? We must get the ladies away from here, away inland, far from the sea. The rest of us must stand a siege in the old tower, so that the enemy will think we're all there. Please God we'll hold out long enough for help to arrive. But we mustn't hang about here. There's the man Dobson mentioned, he may come any second, and we want to be away first. Get the ladder, Dougal. 4 of you take Mr. Heritage, and 2 come with me and carry the ladies' things. It's no raining, but the wind's enough to take the wings off a seagull. Dickson roused Saskia and her cousin, bidding them be ready in 10 minutes. Then with the help of the die-hards he proceeded to transport the necessary supplies, the stove, oil, dishes, clothes, and wraps. More than one journey was needed of small boys, hidden under clouds of baggage. When everything had gone he collected the keys, behind which, in various quarters of the house, 3 gaolers fumed impotently, and gave them to wee Jakey to dispose of in some secret nook. Then he led the 2 ladies to the veranda, the elder cross and sleepy, the younger alert at the prospect of movement. Tell me again, she said. You have locked all the 3 up, and they are now the imprisoned. Well, it was the boys that, properly speaking, did the locking up. It is a great, how do you say, a turning of the tables. Ah, what is that? At the end of the veranda there was a clattering down of pots which could not be due to the wind, since the place was sheltered. There was still only the faintest hint of light, and black night still lurked in the crannies. Followed another fall of pots, as from a clumsy intruder, and then a man appeared, clear against the glass door by which the path descended to the rock garden. It was the 4th man, whom the 3 prisoners had awaited. Dickson had no doubt at all about his identity. He was that villain from whom all the others took their orders, the man whom the princess shuddered at. Before starting he had loaded his pistol. Now he tugged it from his waterproof pocket, pointed it at the other and fired. The man seemed to be hit, for he spun round and clapped a hand to his left arm. Then he fled through the door, which he left open. Dickson was after him like a hound. At the door he saw him running and raised his pistol for another shot. Then he dropped it, for he saw something in the crouching, dodging figure which was familiar. A mistake, he explained to Jakey when he returned. But the shot wasn't wasted. I've just had a good try at killing the factor. Chapter 10 deals with an escape and a journey. 5 scouts' lanterns burned smokily in the ground room of the keep when Dickson ushered his charges through its cavernous door. The lights flickered in the gusts that swept after them and whistled through the slits of window, so that the place was full of monstrous shadows, and its accustomed odor of mold and disuse was changed to a salty freshness. Upstairs on the first floor Thomas Yanai had deposited the ladies' baggage, and was busy making beds out of derelict iron bedsteads and the wraps brought from their room. On the ground floor on a heap of litter covered by an old scout's blanket lay Heritage, with Dougal in attendance. The chieftain had washed the blood from the poet's brow and the touch of cold water was bringing back his senses. Saskia with a cry flew to him, and waved off Dickson who had fetched one of the bottles of liqueur brandy. She slipped a hand inside his shirt and felt the beating of his heart. Then her slim fingers ran over his forehead. "A bad blow," she muttered, "but I do not think he is ill. There is no fracture. When I nursed in the Alexander Hospital I learnt much about head wounds. Do not give him cognac if you value his life." Heritage was talking now and with strange tongues. Phrases like lime digesters and free sulphurous acid came from his lips. He implored someone to tell him if the first cook was finished, and he upbraided someone else for cooling off too fast. The girl raised her head. "But I fear he has become mad," she said. "Wheesht, mem," said Dickson, who recognized the jargon. "He's a paper maker." Saskia sat down on the litter and lifted his head so that it rested on her breast. Dougal at her bidding brought a certain case from her baggage, and with swift, capable hands she made a bandage and rubbed the wound with ointment before tying it up. Then her fingers seemed to play about his temples and along his cheeks and neck. She was the professional nurse now, absorbed, sexless. Heritage ceased to babble, his eyes shut and he was asleep. She remained where she was, so that the poet, when a few minutes later he woke, found himself lying with his head in her lap. She spoke first, in an imperative tone, "You are well now. Your head does not ache. You are strong again." "No." "Yes," he murmured. Then more clearly, "Where am I? Oh, I remember, I caught a lick on the head. What's become of the brutes?" Dickson, who had extracted food from the Mearn Street box and was pressing it on the others, replied through a mouthful of biscuit, "We're in the old tower. The 3 are locked up in the house. Are you feeling better, Mr. Heritage?" The poet suddenly realized Saskia's position and the blood came to his pale face. He got to his feet with an effort and held out a hand to the girl. "I'm all right now, I think. Only a little dicky on my legs. 1,000 thanks, Princess. I've given you a lot of trouble." She smiled at him tenderly. "You say that when you have risked your life for me." "There's no time to waste," the relentless Dougal broke in. "Coming over here, I heard a shot." "What was it?" "It was me," said Dickson. "I was shooting at the factor." "Did you hit him?" "I think so, but I'm sorry to say not badly. When I last saw him he was running too quick for a sore hurt man. When I fired I thought it was the other man, the one they were expecting." Dickson marveled at himself, yet his speech was not bravado but the honest expression of his mind. He was keyed up to a mood in which he feared nothing very much, certainly not the laws of his country. If he fell in with the unknown, he was entirely resolved, if his maker permitted him, to do murder as being the simplest and justest solution. And if in the pursuit of this laudable intention he happened to wing lesser game, it was no fault of his. "Well, it's a pity ye didn't get him," said Dougal, "him being what we ken him to be. I'm for holding a council o' war, and considerin' the whole position. So far we haven't done that badly. We've shifted our base without serious casualties. We've got a far better position to hold, for there's too many ways into yon hoose, and here there's just one. Besides, we've fickled the enemy. They'll take some time to find out where we've gone. But, mind you, we can't count on their staying long shut up. Dobson's no safe in the boiler house, for there's a skylight far up and he'll see it when the light comes and maybe before. So we'd better get our plans ready. A word with ye, Mr. McCunn," and he led Dickson aside. "Do ye ken what these blackguards were up to?" he whispered fiercely in Dickson's ear. "They were going to push eye on the lassie." "How do I ken?" says you. "Because Thomas Yan, I heard Dobson say to Lean at the scullery door, 'Have you got the dope?' he says, and Lean says, 'Eh.'" Thomas minned it the word, for he had heard about it at the Pictus. Dickson exclaimed in horror. "What do ye make o' that?" "I'll tell ye. They want to make sure of her, but they wouldn't have thought o' dope unless the men they expect it were due to arrive any moment. As I see it, we've to face a siege not by the 3 but by a dozen or more, and it'll no be long till it starts. Now, isn't it a mercy we're safe in here?" Dickson returned to the others with a grave face. "Where do you think the new folk are coming from?" he asked. Heritage answered, "From Auchenlacan, I suppose. Or perhaps down from the hills." "You're wrong." And he told of Leon's mistaken confidences to him in the darkness. "They are coming from the sea, just like the old pirates." "The sea," Heritage repeated in a dazed voice. The sea. Think what that means. If they had been coming by the roads, we could have kept track of them, even if they beat us, and some of these laddies could have stuck to them and followed them up till help came. It can't be such an easy job to carry a young lady against her will along Scotch roads. But the sea's a different matter. If they've got a fast boat, they could be out of the Firth and away beyond the law before we could wake up a single policeman. And even if the government took it up and warned all the ports and ships at sea, what's to hinder them to find a hidey hole about Ireland or Norway? I tell you, it's a far more desperate business than I thought, and it'll no do to wait on and trust that the chief constable will turn up afore the mischief's done. The moral, said Heritage, is that there can be no surrender. We've got to stick it out in this old place at all costs. No, said Dickson emphatically. The moral is that we must shift the ladies. We've got the chance while Dobson and his friends are locked up. Let's get them as far away as we can from the sea. They're far safer tramping the moors, and it's no likely the new folk will dare to follow us. But I cannot go. Saskia, who had been listening intently, shook her head. I promised to wait here till my friend came. If I leave, I shall never find him. If you stay, you certainly never will, for you'll be away with the ruffians. Take a sensible view, Mem. You'll be no good to your friend or your friend to you if before night you're rocking in a ship. The girl shook her head again, gently but decisively. It was our arrangement. I cannot break it. Besides, I am sure that he will come in time, for he has never failed. There was a desperate finality about the quiet tones and the weary face with the shadow of a smile on it. Then Heritage spoke. I don't think your plan will quite do, Dogson. Supposing we all break for the hinterland and the Danish brig finds the birds flown, that won't end the trouble. They will get on the princess's trail, and the whole persecution will start again. I want to see things brought to a head here and now. If we can stick it out here long enough, we may trap the whole push and rid the world of a pretty gang of miscreants. Once let them show their hand, and then, if the police are here by that time, we can jug the lot for piracy or something worse. That's all right, said Dougal, but we'd put up a better fight if we had the women off our mind. Have I read that when a castle was going to be besieged the first thing was to get of the civilians? Sensible to the last, Dougal, said Dickson approvingly. That's just what I'm saying. I'm strong for a fight, but put the ladies in a safe bit first, for they are our weak point. Do you think that if you were fighting my enemies, I would consent to be absent? Came Saskia's reproachful question. Deed no, mem, said Dickson heartily. His martial spirit was with Heritage, but his prudence did not sleep, and he suddenly saw a way of placating both. Just you listen to what I propose. What do we amount to? Mr. Heritage, 6 laddies, and myself, and I'm no more used to fighting than an old wife. We've 7 desperate villains against us, and a fortnight they may be 70. We've a fine old castle here, but for defense we want more than stone walls, we want a garrison. I tell you we must get help somewhere. But how, says you? Well, coming here I noticed a gentleman's house away up ayont the railway and close to the hills. The lairds may be not at home, but there will be men there of some kind, gamekeepers and woodmen and such like. My plan is to go there at once and ask for help. Now, it's useless me going alone, for nobody would listen to me. They'd tell me to go back to the shop or they'd think me demented. But with you, mem, it would be a different matter. They wouldn't disbelieve you. So I want you to come with me and to come at once, for God knows how soon our need will be sore. We'll leave your cousin with Mrs. Moran in the village, for bed's the place for her, and then you and me will be off on our business. The girl looked at Heritage, who nodded. It's the only way, he said. Get every man jack you can raise, and if it's humanly possible get a gun or 2. I believe there's time enough, for I don't see the brig arriving in broad daylight. Do you not? Dickson asked rudely. Have you considered what day this is? It's the Sabbath, the best of days for an ill deed. There's no kirk hereaways, and everybody in the parish will be sitting indoors by the fire. He looked at his watch. In half an hour it'll be light. Haste you, mem, and get ready. Dougal, what's the weather? The chieftain swung open the door, and sniffed the air. The wind had fallen for the time being, and the surge of the tides below the rocks rose like the clamour of a mob. With the lull, mist and a thin drizzle had cloaked the world again. To Dickson's surprise Dougal seemed to be in good spirits. He began to sing to a hymn tune a strange ditty. Class conscious we are, and class conscious will be. Till our fits on the neck o' the bourgeoisie. What on earth are you singing? Dickson inquired. Dougal grinned. Wee Jakey went to a socialist Sunday school last winter because he heard they were for fechtin' battles. And they telled him he was to join a thing called an international, and Jakey thought it was a fitba club. But when he found out there was no magic lantern or sweary at Christmas he jeed at the chuck. They learned him a heap o' queer songs. That's one. What does the last word mean? I don't ken. Jakey thought it was some kind of a dragon. It's a daft-like thing anyway. When's high water? Dougal answered that to the best of his knowledge it fell between 4 and 5 in the afternoon. Then that's when we may expect the foreign gentry if they think to bring their boat into the Garplefoot. Dougal, lad, I trust you to keep a most careful and prayerful watch. You had better get the die-hards out of the tower and all round the place afore Dobson and company get loose, or you'll no get a chance later. Don't lose your mobility, as the sodgers say. Mr. Heritage can hold the fort, but you laddies should be spread out like a screen. That was my notion, said Dougal. I'll detail 2 die-hards, Thomas Yawnai and wee Jakey, to keep in touch with ye and watch for ye coming back. Thomas ye ken already, ye'll know fickle Thomas Yawnai. But don't be mistook about wee Jakey. He's terrible fond of greetin', but it's no fright with him but excitement. It's just a habit he's gotten. When ye see Jakey begin to greet, ye may be sure that Jakey's getting dangerous. The door shut behind them and Dickson found himself with his 2 charges in a world dim with fog and rain and the still lingering darkness. The air was raw, and had the sour smell which comes from soaked earth and wet boughs when the leaves are not yet fledged. Both the women were miserably equipped for such an expedition. Cousin Eugenie trailed heavy furs, Saskia's only wrap was a bright, colored shawl about her shoulders, and both wore thin foreign shoes. Dickson insisted on stripping off his trusty waterproof and forcing it on the princess, on whose slim body it hung very loose and very short. The elder woman stumbled and whimpered and needed the constant support of his arm, walking like a townswoman from the knees. But Saskia swung from the hips like a free woman, and Dickson had much ado to keep up with her. She seemed to delight in the bitter freshness of the dawn, inhaling deep breaths of it, and humming fragments of a tune. Guided by Thomas Yauno they took the road which Dickson and Heritage had travelled the first evening, through the shrubberies on the north side of the house and the side avenue beyond which the ground fell to the lava glen. On their right the house rose like a dark cloud, but Dickson had lost his terror of it. There were 3 angry men inside it, he remembered, long let them stay there. He marvelled at his mood, and also rejoiced, for his worst fear had always been that he might prove a coward. Now he was puzzled to think how he could ever be frightened again, for his one object was to succeed, and in that absorption fear seemed to him merely a waste of time. It all comes of treating the thing as a business proposition, he told himself. But there was far more in his heart than this sober resolution. He was intoxicated with the resurgence of youth and felt a rapture of audacity which he never remembered in his decorous boyhood. I haven't been doing badly for an old man, he reflected with glee. What had become of the pillar of commerce, the man who might have been a baillie had he sought municipal honours, the elder in the Guthrie Memorial Kirk, the instructor of literary young men? In the past 3 days he had levanted with jewels which had once been an emperor's and certainly were not his, he had burglariously entered and made free of a strange house, he had played hide and seek at the risk of his neck and had wrestled in the dark with a foreign miscreant, he had shot at an eminent solicitor with intent to kill, and he was now engaged in tramping the world with a fairy tale princess. I blush to confess that of each of his doings he was unashamedly proud, and thirsted for many more in the same line. Gosh, but I'm seeing life, was his unregenerate conclusion. Without sight or sound of a human being, they descended to the lava, climbed again by the cart track, and passed the deserted West Lodge and into the village. It was almost full dawn when the 3 stood in Mrs. Moran's kitchen. "I've brought you 2 ladies, Auntie Femi," said Dickson. They made an odd group in that cheerful place, where the new lit fire was crackling in the big grate, the wet undignified form of Dickson, unshaven of cheek and chin and disreputable in garb, the shrouded figure of Cousin Eugenie, who had sunk into the arm-chair and closed her eyes, the slim girl, into whose face the weather had whipped a glow like blossom, and the hostess, with her petticoats kilted and an ancient mutch on her head. Mrs. Moran looked once at Saskia, and then did a thing which she had not done since her girlhood. She curtsied. "I'm proud to see ye here, mem. Off wa your things, and I'll get ye dry clays. Losh, ye fair sock pin. And your shoon. Ye maun change your feet. Dickson. Awa up to the loft, and dinna you stir till I give ye a cry. The leddies will change by the fire. And you, mem, this to Cousin Eugenie, the place for use your bed. I'll kindle a fire ben the who's in a jiffy. And syne ye'll have breakfast, ye'll ha a cup o' tea me now, for the kettle's just on the boil. Awa ye, Dickson, and she stamped her foot. Dickson departed, and in the loft washed his face, and smoked a pipe on the edge of the bed, watching the mist eddying up the village street. From below rose the sounds of hospitable bustle, and when after some 20 minutes' vigil he descended, he found Saskia toasting stocking toes by the fire in the great arm-chair, and Mrs. Moran setting the table. "Auntie Femi, hearken to me. We've taken on too big a job for 2 men and 6 laddies, and help we've got to get, and that this very morning. Do you mind the big white house away up near the hills ayont the station and east of the A road? It looked like a gentleman's shooting lodge. I was thinking of trying there. Mercy! The exclamation was wrung from him by his eyes settling on Saskia and noting her apparel. Gone were her thin foreign clothes, and in their place she wore a heavy tweed skirt cut very short, and thick homespun stockings, which had been made for someone with larger feet than hers. A pair of the coarse low-heeled shoes, which country folk wear in the farmyard, stood warming by the hearth. She still had her russet jumper, but round her neck hung a grey wool scarf, of the kind known as a comforter. Amazingly pretty she looked in Dickson's eyes, but with a different kind of prettiness. The sense of fragility had fled, and he saw how nobly built she was for all her exquisiteness. She looked like a queen, he thought, but a queen to go gypsying through the world with. There's some o' Elspeth's things, ra'll gid fur thy claes, said Mrs. Moran complacently. And the shoon are what she used to gang about the byres wi when she was in the Castlewam dairy. The leddy was telling me she was for tramp in the hills, and they things will keep her dry and warm. I ken the whos ye mean. They see at the mains of Garple. And I ken the man that bides in it. His yin Sir Archibald Roy Lance. English, but his mither was a DL. I'm no will acquaint wi his forebears, but I'm will a newch acquaint wi Sir Archie, and better a gid coo than a coo o a gid kind, as my mither used to say. He used to be an awfu wild callant, a friend o pure Maester Quentin, and up to one devilry. But they tell me he's a quieter lad since the war, and Sir lamed by Fa in Uto an aeroplane. Will he be at the mains just now? Dickson asked. I would no wonder. He has a muckle place in England, but I used to come here in the back end for the shoot-in and in April for birds. He's clean daft about birds. He'll be out a day at the Craig watching Solans, or lying a morning I the moss looking at bog blitters. Will he help, think you? I'll wager he'll help. Anyway, it's your best chance, and better a wee bush than nae-bield. Now, sit into your breakfast. It was a merry meal. Mrs. Moran dispensed tea and gnomic wisdom. Saskia ate heartily, speaking little, but once or twice laying her hand softly on her hostess's gnarled fingers. Dickson was in such spirits that he gobbled shamelessly, being both hungry and hurried, and he spoke of the still unconquered enemy with ease and disrespect, so that Mrs. Moran was moved to observe that there was naething sae bald as a blind mare. But when in a sudden return of modesty he belittled his usefulness and talked somberly of his mature years, he was told that he would never be all sae muckle honesty. Indeed, it was very clear that Mrs. Moran approved of her nephew. They did not linger over breakfast, for both were impatient to be on the road. Mrs. Moran assisted Saskia to put on Elspeth's shoes. Even a young fit finds comfort in an old bauchel, as my mother, honest woman, used to say. Dickson's waterproof was restored to him, and for Saskia an old raincoat belonging to the son in South Africa was discovered, which fitted her better. "Sicken weather," said the hostess, as she opened the door to let in a swirl of wind. "The deil's I kind to his ain. Haste ye back, mem, and be sure I'll tak good care o' your leddy cousin." The proper way to the mains of Garple was either by the station and the A road, or by the Auchenlecan highway, branching off half a mile beyond the Garple bridge. But Dickson, who had been studying the map and fancied himself as a pathfinder, chose the direct route across the long muir as being at once shorter and more sequestered. With the dawn the wind had risen again, but it had shifted towards the north-west and was many degrees colder. The mist was furling on the hills like sails, the rain had ceased, and out at sea the eye covered a mile or two of wild water. The moor was drenching wet, and the peat bogs were brimming with inky pools, so that soon the travellers were soaked to the knees. Dickson had no fear of pursuit, for he calculated that Dobson and his friends, even if they had got out, would be busy looking for the truants in the vicinity of the house and would presently be engaged with the old tower. But he realized, too, that speed on his errand was vital, for at any moment the unknown might arrive from the sea. So he kept up a good pace, half running, half striding, till they had passed the railway, and he found himself gasping with a stitch in his side, and compelled to rest in the lee of what had once been a sheepfold. Saskia amazed him. She moved over the rough heather like a deer, and it was her hand that helped him across the deeper hags. Before such youth and vigor he felt clumsy and old. She stood looking down at him as he recovered his breath, cool, unruffled, alert as Diana. His mind fled to heritage, and it occurred to him suddenly that the poet had set his affections very high. Loyalty drove him to speak a word for his friend. "I've got the easy job," he said. "Mr. Heritage will have the whole pack on him in that old tower, and him with such a sore clout on his head. I've left him my pistol. He's a terrible brave man." She smiled. And he's a poet too." "So," she said. "I did not know. He is very young. He's a man of very high ideals." She puzzled at the word, and then smiled. "I know him. He is like many of our young men in Russia, the students. His mind is in a ferment and he does not know what he wants. But he is brave." This seemed to Dickson's loyal soul but a chilly tribute. "I think he is in love with me," she continued. He looked up startled and saw in her face that which gave him a view into a strange new world. He had thought that women blushed when they talked of love, but her eyes were as grave and candid as a boy's. Here was one who had gone through waters so deep that she had lost the foibles of sex. Love to her was only a word of ill omen, a threat on the lips of brutes, an extra battalion of peril in an army of perplexities. He felt like some homely rustic who finds himself swept unwittingly into the moonlight hunt of Artemis and her maidens. "He is a romantic," she said. "I have known so many like him." "He's know that," said Dickson shortly. "Why, he used to be laughing at me for being romantic. He's one that's looking for truth and reality, he says, and he's terrible down on the kind of poetry I like myself." She smiled. "They all talk so. But you, my friend Dickson," she pronounced the name in 2 staccato syllables ever so prettily, "you are different. Tell me about yourself." "I'm just what you see, a middle-aged retired grocer." "Grocer?" she queried. "Ah, yes, epicier. But you are a very remarkable epicier. Mr. Heritage I understand, but you and those little boys, no. I am sure of one thing, you are not a romantic. You are too humorous and I think you are like Ulysses, for it would not be easy to defeat you." Her eyes were kind, nay affectionate, and Dickson experienced a preposterous rapture in his soul, followed by a sinking, as he realized how far the job was still from being completed. "We must be getting on, ma'am," he said hastily, and the two plunged again into the heather. The air road was crossed, and the fir wood around the mains became visible, and presently the white gates of the entrance. A wind-blown spire of smoke beyond the trees proclaimed that the house was not untenanted. As they entered the drive the Scots firs were tossing in the gale, which blew fiercely at this altitude, but, the dwelling itself being more in the hollow, the daffodil clumps on the lawn were but mildly fluttered. The door was opened by a one-armed butler who bore all the marks of the old regular soldier. Dickson produced a card and asked to see his master on urgent business. Sir Archibald was at home, he was told, and had just finished breakfast. The two were led into a large bare chamber which had all the chill and mustiness of a bachelor's drawing room. The butler returned, and said Sir Archibald would see him. "I'd better go myself first and prepare the way, mem," Dickson whispered and followed the man across the hall. He found himself ushered into a fair-sized room where a bright fire was burning. On a table lay the remains of breakfast, and the odor of food mingled pleasantly with the scent of peat. The horns and heads of big game, foxes' masks, the model of a gigantic salmon and several bookcases adorned the wall, and books and maps were mixed with decanters and cigar boxes on the long sideboard. After the wild out of doors the place seemed the very shrine of comfort. A young man sat in an armchair by the fire with a leg on a stool. He was smoking a pipe and reading The Field, and on another stool at his elbow was a pile of new novels. He was a pleasant brown-faced young man, with remarkably smooth hair and a roving humorous eye. "Come in, Mr. McCunn. Very glad to see you. If, as I take it, you're the grocer, you're a household name in these parts. I get all my supplies from you, and I've just been marking inroads on one of your divine hams. Now, what can I do for you?" "I'm very proud to hear what you say, Sir Archibald. But I've not come on business. I've come with the queerest story you ever heard in your life, and I've come to ask your help." "Go ahead. A good story is just what I want this vile morning. I'm not here alone. I've a lady with me." "God bless my soul. A lady?" A princess. She's in the next room." The young man looked wildly at him and waved the book he had been reading. "Excuse me, Mr. McCunn, but are you quite sober?" "I beg your pardon." "I see you are. But you know, it isn't done. Princesses don't as a rule come here after breakfast to pass the time of day. It's more absurd than this shocker I've been reading. All the same, it's a fact. She'll tell you the story herself, and you'll believe her quick enough. But to prepare your mind, I'll just give you a sketch of the events of the last few days." Before the sketch was concluded, the young man had violently rung the bell. "Syme," he shouted to the servant, "clear away this mess and lay the table again. Order more breakfast, all the breakfast you can get. Open the windows and get the tobacco smoke out of the air. Tidy up the place, for there's a lady coming. Quick, you juggins." He was on his feet now, and, with his arm in Dickson's, was heading for the door. "My sainted aunt! And you topped off with potin at the factor. I've seen a few things in my day, but I'm blessed if I ever met a bird like you."